Texas, in the fading days of 1883. The sun was not a comfort. It was a punishment, a hot iron pressing down on the cracked, red earth. In the town of Buckthorn Ferry, the wind was a living thing, a restless spirit that kicked up devils of rust-colored dust, flinging grit into the eyes and mouths of every soul unfortunate enough to be outdoors. The town itself was little more than a collection of ambitious shacks clinging to a low crossing on the Brazos River. It lived and breathed on the rhythm of the market day. Today, the market was in full throat. The air, thick enough to chew, was a foul broth of smells, the sour tang of cheap whiskey leaking from the saloon doors, the sharp ammonia of livestock, the rank sweat of unwashed men, and the greasy smoke of frying bacon from a vendor's cart. Sounds clashed in the heat. Horses screamed, not in strength, but in protest. The heavy iron-shod wheels of freight wagons ground the dirt, a sound like teeth chewing stones. Above it all, men's voices barked and haggled, a relentless chorus of commerce and desperation. Spurs chimed on the warped boardwalks, a sharp counterpoint to the dull thud of boots in the deep dust of the main street. Wedged between the blacksmith's forge and the town's algae-slicked well was the auction pen. It was a temporary thing, hammered together from raw pine planks that were already warping in the relentless sun. Inside this flimsy corral, a creature trembled. It was a roan horse, or perhaps had been one once. Now, its coat was faded and patchy, its ribs a washboard pattern beneath the hide, its hip bones jutting out like axe blades. Its head hung low, breath stirring the dust, skin twitching as it fought a losing war against a cloud of black flies. A crowd of men, numbering perhaps 24, leaned against the rails or squatted on their heels in the thin shade of the general store's overhang. They were waiting for the end. The main business, good cattle, strong mules, bagged cotton, was done. This was the dregs, the leftovers, the entertainment for those with nothing better to do than watch misery change hands. Standing apart from them, Carver Wynn watched. He was 36 years old, though the land and the solitude had carved at least another decade onto his face. He was the owner of a ranch perched on the 7-mile mesa, a place as isolated as its name suggested. Carver was a man built of quiet angles. He was tall, with shoulders broad enough to imply a strength he rarely used. He wore a black hat, its brim pulled low, casting his face in a permanent shadow that obscured all but the patience in his eyes. He was not a man who enjoyed towns. He was here for one purpose: to find a pack horse, something sturdy enough to carry supplies up the mesa and cheap enough to justify the trip. He'd been watching the roan, calculating its chances of survival against the cost. The auctioneer, a man named Silas Croft with a stained vest and a voice like gravel, was about to call the last item. "All right, gentlemen, the roan mare. She's seen better days, but there's life in her yet. Who'll start the bidding at, say, $5? Silence. A man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Before Croft could plead his case, a new voice cut through the heavy air. "Hold on, Silas. Got one more item, an add-on, a bonus for whatever lucky bastard buys this nag." The voice belonged to a man named Sloan, a drifter who smelled of the whiskey he'd clearly been drinking since sunup. He stumbled out from the alley beside the saloon, dragging something behind him by a length of coarse hemp rope. It was not livestock. It was a girl. She looked to be about 19, though, like Carver, the dirt and the hardship made it hard to tell. Her hair, the color of damp straw, was matted with alkali dust and bits of chaff. She wore a dress of gray homespun, torn at the hem and stained with things Carver didn't want to name. The rope was looped around her wrists, held tight in Sloane's meaty fist. He shoved her forward, and she stumbled. Catching her balance on the dusty ground, she did not look up. "Found this one?" Sloane announced, his voice slurring. "A stray. But she's got papers." He waved a dirty, folded document. "An indenture, run off from her last master east of Dallas. She's deaf as a post and dumb as a rock, but she works hard. I tell you, cleans, cooks, whatever you need, and she's cheap." The crowd shifted. This was different. A few men chuckled nervously. Others looked away. But most just watched. Their curiosity piqued. This was a grim break in the monotony. Carver Wynn felt his stomach tighten. He'd seen ugly things, seen drought kill cattle, seen storms tear roofs from houses. But this felt different. This felt unclean. "What's the bid? Sloan?" someone called out. "She comes with the horse," Sloan spat. "2 for 1, $10 for the pair." Now the girl looked up. And that was when Carver Wynn stopped breathing. She was not crying. She was not pleading. Her face, smudged with dirt, was a mask of absolute stillness. But her eyes were alive. They were clear, the color of a winter sky. And they were fixed. Not on Sloan, not on the crowd, but on the middle distance. She looked straight ahead, her gaze flat, calm, and terrifyingly empty. It was the calm of a deep lake just before a storm breaks. It was the look of someone who had seen the absolute worst of men and was simply waiting for the next blow to fall. She was unbroken, but she was trapped behind that terrible, silent stillness. That gaze hit Carver like a physical blow. It cut right through the noise, the heat, and his own weariness. He'd come for a broken horse. He was looking at a human soul that refused to break. A man near him, a rancher with a cruel mouth, nudged his neighbor. "What's the matter? Wynn looking to buy some livestock, or you starting a harem up on that lonely mesa of yours?" Laughter, sharp and ugly, rippled through the men. Carver ignored them. His shadowed eyes stayed fixed on the girl. He saw her flinch, just slightly. As Sloan gave the rope a vicious tug, she didn't make a sound. He reached into the pocket of his canvas coat. His hand, calloused and brown from the sun, pulled out a worn leather pouch. He didn't look at the mocking faces. He didn't look at Sloan. He looked at the girl. Slowly, deliberately. He untied the leather thong and tipped coins into his palm. He counted. $1, $2, $3. He had $12 and some change. Enough for the horse, and now for this. He closed his hand around the coins. His voice, when it came, was dry, cracked with dust and disuse. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the laughter like a cold knife. "Both," he said. The laughter died. Silas Croft, the auctioneer, looked confused. "What's that? Win?" Carver stepped forward, out of the shade. The sun hit his broad shoulders. "I said both, the horse and the human." Sloane's eyes widened, a greedy light flashing in their drunken depths. "Well, now, a real gentleman, $10, win, and they're yours." Carver walked past the auctioneer, right up to Sloan. He opened his hand and dropped the silver dollars, one by one, into Sloane's grasping palm. He kept back the $2 and change. "The papers," Carver said. His voice was flat. Sloan chuckled, pocketing the money. Sure. He fumbled in his shirt and produced the crumpled document, thrusting it at Carver. Then, with a grin, he held out the rope. Carver took the papers and stuffed them, unread, into his pocket. He looked at the rope, then at Sloane's hand, then back at the girl. He did not take the rope. Instead, he stepped past Sloan, moving between the man and the girl. He stood in front of her. She was shorter than him, her head barely reaching his chest. She was still looking at that empty spot in the distance. Gently, Carver reached for her wrists. She flinched, a violent, sudden tremor, but he held his hands steady. He wasn't grabbing. He was showing her his palms. He pointed at the knot, his fingers large and clumsy against her small, raw-boned wrists. She stared at his hands for a long second. Then, slowly, she turned her wrists over, offering him the knot. His fingers, stained with dirt and grease from mending tackle. Worked at the coarse hemp. He was slow, patient, as if he were working a splinter out of a hoof. The knot was tight, caked with sweat and grime. He didn't pull or rush it, he just worked, his thumbnail digging into the fibers, until the loop loosened. He unwound the rope, letting it fall away from her skin. He straightened up. He coiled the rope. Once, twice, in his big hand. Sloane was still standing there, grinning, expecting his rope back. Carver threw it. He didn't toss it. He threw it hard, like he was throwing a chain. It hit the dust at Sloane's feet, a coiled, dead thing. "Get the horse," Carver said to Silas Croft. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on the crowd, on Sloane, on the entire filthy market, and began walking toward his wagon. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He didn't need to. He heard her steps, light and uneven in the deep dust, falling in just behind his own. She didn't cling to him. She didn't rush to keep up. She just followed, a silent shadow in the blistering heat. He reached his wagon, a sturdy buckboard parked near the edge of town. He untied the reins, his movements economical and precise. He felt, rather than saw, her stop beside the rear wheel. Then he felt a touch. It was impossibly light, a bare graze of fingertips against the canvas of his sleeve. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a grab for safety. It was a question, an acknowledgement. It felt like a single, quiet statement. "I am here. I choose to trust you." The touch was gone as quickly as it came. Carver froze for a second. The simple, silent contact rattled him more than all the jeers of the crowd. He turned. She was standing there, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes now on him. She wasn't looking at him, but at his chest, as if she were afraid to meet his gaze. He nodded curtly at the wagon bed. "Get in." She moved without hesitation, climbing over the wheel and settling herself in the corner of the buckboard. She curled into the smallest possible space, her knees drawn up, her arms wrapped around them. She turned her face away from him, toward the sun-scorched hills that shimmered in the heat. Carver fetched the roan mare, her hooves dragging, and tied her lead rope to the tailgate. He climbed onto the driver's seat, his jaw tight, his teeth gritted. He snapped the reins, a sharp crack that sent a jolt through his team. The wagon lurched forward, leaving Buckthorn Ferry and its marketplace behind. The road home was long. It wound away from the river, up into the dry, thorny country of the high plains. The wheels ground over rock and sand, and the sun beat down. For the first hour, the only sound was the jingle of the harness, the creak of the wagon, and the pathetic, stumbling gait of the roan mare behind them. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. It was the silence of a room that had been sealed for a long time, and someone had just, finally, cracked open a window. The air inside was heavy, but it was moving. As the afternoon bled away, the savage heat softened. The sky turned a bruised, aching purple at the edges. The mesquite bushes threw long, skeletal shadows across the trail. Carver did not speak, and the girl did not move. She just watched the world go by, her stillness a strange anchor in the rattling, moving wagon. It was full dark when they reached the turnoff for 7 Mile Mesa. The air was cooler up here, with the scent of pine and dry grass. Another hour of climbing, and the wagon rolled into the yard of Carver's ranch. It was not much. A small house built of gray, faded wood, a solid-looking barn, a windmill turning slowly in the night breeze, and a series of corrals, their fences rickety but mended in a dozen places. The whole place was swept clean. It was the home of a man who had only work and solitude for company. It was enough for one lonely man. Now, it would have to be enough for 2 souls. He pulled the team to a halt. He got down, his limbs stiff. He walked to the back of the wagon. The girl hadn't moved. She was just a small, dark shape in the corner. "We're here," he said, his voice low. She stirred, uncurling herself. She moved to the edge and swung herself down before he could offer a hand. She landed softly in the dirt and stood waiting, her head bowed. Carver unhitched the team, his movements fluid in the moonlight. He led them to the water trough. The girl just stood by the wagon. He took the roan mare, untied her, and led her into the barn, into an empty stall with fresh hay. When he came back out, she was still there. He walked past her, up the 2 steps to the porch of the small house. He pushed the door open. Inside. It was dark and smelled of wood smoke and old leather. He stepped inside, struck a match, and lit the kerosene lamp on the table. It cast a weak, yellow glow. He turned back. She was at the bottom of the steps, watching the light. Carver looked at her. He thought of the drunken man's words, deaf as a post and dumb as a rock. He didn't know how to speak to her. He looked around the simple room. On a small shelf by the door, among some old nails and a whetstone, was a small nub of white chalk. He picked it up. He stepped back onto the porch. He didn't gesture for her to come up. He simply walked to the wooden frame of the door, the wood weathered gray like the rest of the house. He held the chalk out to her. She looked at the chalk, then at his face. Her expression was unreadable in the shadows. He didn't speak. He just pointed from the chalk to the door frame. It was a question. Slowly, as if afraid it might be a trick, she reached out and took the chalk from his large, rough hand. Her fingers were slender, chapped, and cold. She stepped up onto the porch, moving past him into the lamplight. She stood before the doorframe for a long moment, the chalk poised in her hand. Then, in a neat, surprisingly steady script, she wrote on the wood 2 words, Mariel Quill. The first light found Carver already awake. He was a man accustomed to waking before the sun, his body timed to the rhythms of necessity rather than comfort. For years, the only sound in the small house was his own, the creak of the cot, the rasp of his boots on the floor, the metallic scrape of the pump handle. This morning, there was a new silence, the silence of another human presence, sleeping just a few feet away in the small storage room he had cleared for her, separated only by a hanging canvas curtain. He dressed in the gray dark, pulling on his stiff denim trousers and flannel shirt, his movements quiet by long habit. He expected to find her asleep, exhausted from the ordeal of the previous day. But when he glanced at the cot, it was empty. The blanket was folded neatly, a perfect square. At the foot of the mattress, a knot of apprehension tightened in his chest. Had she run? He hadn't barred the door. The thought of her, deaf and alone in the high mesa scrubland, sent a chill through him. He moved quickly, pulling on his boots, and stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp and cold. The first line of pale yellow light was just touching the eastern rim of the mesa. He scanned the yard. Nothing. Then he heard it, or rather, felt it, a low, rhythmic movement from the barn. He walked across the yard, his boots stirring the dust. He slipped the barn door open. She was there. She was not trying to steal anything. She was not hiding. She was in the stall with the roan mare, the horse that had been the excuse for her purchase. The animal was still terrified, tucked into the far corner, its skin trembling in visible waves, a sheen of cold sweat on its neck. The mare's eyes were wide, showing the whites, and its breath came in ragged, panicked snorts. Mariel was not approaching it. She was standing near the stall gate, holding a damp rag. She was breathing slowly and deeply, her own shoulders rising and falling in a deliberate, peaceful rhythm. She watched the horse, and as Carver watched her, he saw her entire body was a projection of calm. Then, slowly, she began to move. She took one step into the stall. The mare flinched, stamping a hoof. Mariel froze, waited, and resumed that slow, even breathing. She took another step. Carver remained in the shadows, unmoving. He had gentled horses his whole life, usually with a short rope, a firm hand, and a bucket of oats. This was something else. This was not breaking. It was inviting. She reached the horse. The mare was pressed against the back wall, trembling violently. Marielle didn't reach for its head or its neck. She turned slightly, presenting her shoulder, and began to wipe the wall of the stall, her motions circular and slow. She didn't look at the horse. She just worked, the rag moving, her breath steady. The sound was only in the movement. The mare's snorting softened. It watched her. After a long minute, its head, which had been held high in terror, dropped an inch. Marielle kept wiping, her movements predictable, unthreatening. She moved the rag from the wall to the horse's shoulder. The mare jumped, but Marielle didn't pull back. She just rested her hand there, continuing the same slow, circular motion, her breath unchanged. She wiped the cold sweat from the animal's coat, moving from the shoulder up to the tense, knotted muscles of the neck. The mare let out a long, shuddering sigh. Its head dropped lower. It stopped trembling. Marielle continued her work, wiping, breathing, until the horse was still, its eyes no longer wide with fear, but half closed in a daze of newfound peace. Carver let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had seen horse whisperers at fairs, men who put on a grand show. This was the opposite. This was a conversation held in a language he did not speak, a language of absolute stillness. He stepped out of the shadow. The floorboard creaked. Marielle turned, startled, but not afraid. She simply looked at him, her hand still resting on the mare's neck. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, and turned to the stalls of his harness team. He had to establish a routine. He was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one. He had not bought a guest. He had taken on a responsibility, and that responsibility had to earn its keep. When he finished feeding the team, he found her waiting by the door, her hands clasped, watching him. He gestured. He pointed to the wood stove. "Fire," he mouthed, then pointed to the kindling box. He pointed to the water pails. "Water." He pointed to the main room, at the floor. "Sweep." Finally, he picked up a snapped rein from his workbench. "Mend," he said, tapping the broken leather. He expected confusion, resistance, perhaps tears. He got none. She looked at each item, her gaze sharp and intelligent. She looked at the stove, the pails, the broom, the broken rein. She looked at him, and she nodded. A single, crisp nod. Carver felt a strange, awkward relief. "Good," he said, then remembered. He just nodded back and went outside. Pulling his hat low, he had fences to check on the north pasture. It would take him half the day. He worked, his mind occupied with the familiar calculus of ranching wind, water, and wire. He tried not to think about the quiet woman in his house. He returned hours later, past noon, the sun high and hot. He was bracing himself for, he didn't know what. A cold stove, a mess. He stepped onto the porch and stopped. The doorframe, their new chalkboard, had fresh writing on it. Her neat script was there, below her name. "Lard caddy low, wind changed, smell of damp earth, mouse in the oat bin." He stared at the words. He pushed the door open. The house was transformed. The pails were full of fresh water. The stove was not cold, but banked perfectly. A bed of coals glowing, ready for cooking. The floor, which he usually swept once a week, was immaculate, the dust of years gone from the corners. On the table, the broken rein was stitched. The stitchwork was finer than his own, the thread waxed, the leather oiled. He went to the pantry. He lifted the heavy lid of the lard caddy. It was almost empty. He'd forgotten to check. He went to the oat bin by the back door, the one he used for the chickens. He looked inside. Sure enough, in the corner, a small pile of fresh droppings. In the wind, he stepped back outside. He sniffed the air. He'd smelled only dust and sun all morning, but now, focusing, he caught it, a faint, sharp, mineral tang, distinct from the usual dry grass, the smell of damp earth, just as she'd written. He looked at the horizon. The sky was a brilliant, empty blue. There wasn't a cloud in sight. He shook his head. 2 out of 3 wasn't bad. He found her in the yard, scrubbing his shirts on a washboard. He hadn't even asked her to. The afternoon wore on. The heat grew, becoming heavy, oppressive. The air felt thick, difficult to breathe. Carver sat on the porch, mending a saddle stirrup, the leather stiff in his hands. That smell she'd mentioned, the damp earth, it was stronger now. And it was joined by that other scent, the one he knew from his childhood, the smell of metal, the smell of ozone. The sky was still blue. Marielle came out of the house, wiping her hands on an apron she must have found. She walked to the edge of the porch, her head tilted, as if listening. She stood that way for a full minute, a statue of concentration. Then she moved. She didn't walk. She ran to him. She grabbed his sleeve, tugging, her eyes wide. "What is it?" he asked. She shook her head, a violent motion, and pointed, not at the sky, but at the horizon, to the west. Carver looked. He saw nothing, just the blue, shimmering heat over the hills. "There's no storm," he said. She stamped her foot, a single, frustrated sound. She grabbed his arm again, pulling him off the bench. She pointed, her finger trembling. She wanted him to look. And then he saw it. Not a cloud, but a change in the light, a flicker. He squinted. Miles away, a few clouds were piling up, low and dark, like a bruise on the skyline. But that wasn't what she was pointing at. She was pointing at the old, half-dead eucalyptus tree behind the barn. "The tree," he said, confused. She shook her head, frantic. She pointed at the sky above the tree, then at the tree, then at the sky. She was trying to connect them. Before he could understand, the world tore open. There was no thunder, no warning. The air exploded. A bolt of lightning, white-hot and jagged, leaped from the clear blue sky and struck the eucalyptus tree. The sound was a single, deafening crack that Carver felt in his teeth. The tree vanished in a blast of white fire. Splinters of wood rained down. And then, fire. The dry, oily wood erupted, a tower of flame shooting 50 feet into the air. Carver was frozen for a second, stunned by the sheer violence of it. Marielle was already moving. Sparks and burning leaves were cascading onto the dry, shingled roof of the barn. A new calf, born just last week, was bellowing in the small corral attached to the barn, panicked by the noise and the sudden, searing heat. "The calf!" Carver yelled. Running, he vaulted the corral fence, grabbing the panicked animal. He didn't need to yell for her. She was thinking of the barn itself. She ran to the heavy sliding door. A wave of sparks hit the roof, and a small curl of smoke began to rise. She grabbed the heavy wooden door and, with a strength he didn't know she possessed, hauled it shut, sealing the hay and the animals inside from the rain of fire. Carver hoisted the calf, throwing it over the fence into the main pasture, clear of the danger. He turned back. The barn wall itself, the side nearest the burning tree, was smoking. "Water, get the buck." She was already at the horse trough. She didn't bother with the buckets. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket he kept for covering horses and shoved it deep into the water. She pulled the sopping, heavy mass out, staggering under the weight. He understood. He grabbed one end. She grabbed the other, and they ran to the barn. They threw the wet blanket against the smoking wall. A cloud of steam hissed into the air. They worked without a single word. They were a team. He ran to the pump, filling buckets, and she, anticipating his every move, grabbed them, soaking the wall, the roof, the ground. They worked in the blistering heat of the burning tree, their faces scorched, their lungs filling with smoke, until the fire on the barn was out. The tree continued to burn, a massive torch against the darkening sky. but the barn was safe. They collapsed against the far fence, breathing hard, soaked in water and sweat, covered in soot. Carver looked at her. Her hair was matted, her face black with ash, but her eyes were clear and bright. She had heard it. He knew it now. She hadn't seen the lightning. She hadn't heard the thunder. She had felt it coming. She had felt the charge building in the air, felt it connect to that dry tree. That night, they sat by the stove. The storm had finally broken, and a cold rain lashed the windows. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Carver looked at the woman across the small room, who was quietly mending a tear in her own worn dress. He realized, with a jolt, that she was not deaf. She just listened to a different world. The next day, the shift was complete. He no longer saw her as a burden, but as a partner. He watched her. His best cow, a heavy brindle, was pregnant and due. She was agitated, pacing the corral, refusing to eat. Carver recognized the signs of a difficult birth. He saw Mariel go to the small, overgrown herb patch his mother had planted a decade ago. She knelt, her fingers brushing the leaves, smelling them. She picked a handful of wild mint. She brought it back, crushed the leaves between her palms, and dropped them into the cow's water trough. Carver started to object. That won't... He stopped himself. He waited. The cow, drawn by the sharp, fresh scent, approached the trough. It sniffed, then drank. A long, deep drink. Mariel stood nearby, her hand resting on the top rail of the fence, projecting that same calm he'd seen her use on the roan mare. Within an hour, the cow's agitation eased. It lay down in the clean straw. At sunset, the cow delivered a healthy calf, easily and without a single complication. Carver began to listen. He started paying attention to the things he had always ignored. He noticed how the wind smelled when it came from the north versus the south. He listened to the breathing of his cattle, noticing the subtle changes before a sickness took hold. He began, for the first time in his life, to hear the sound of the world's quiet. A few days later, the flies, drawn by the summer's end, became a plague. They tormented the animals, filling the barn with a maddening buzz. Mariel went out, not to the herb garden, but to the creek bed. She returned with armfuls of wild lemongrass. She tied them into small bundles and hung them from the windows of the house and the rafters of the barn. Within a day, the flies were gone. The barn, which had always carried the sharp tang of ammonia and manure, now smelled clean, with a faint citrus scent. The calves, no longer stressed and stamping, rested more easily. They put on weight. It was a small thing, but it was everything. The ranch was quiet, but it was no longer empty. The silence was shared. One night, Carver woke from a hard dream. He didn't dream often, but when he did, they were dark memories of his father's last days. The anger, the failure, the suffocating loneliness of the mesa. He sat up, his heart pounding, a cold sweat on his neck. The lamp was burning low on the table. Beside it, there was a small, white square. He stared at it. It was a handkerchief, faded linen with a small, embroidered woe in the corner. It was his mother's. He kept it in a locked wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. He hadn't opened that trunk in 5 years. He looked at the curtain to her room. It was still. He picked up the handkerchief. It still held a faint, ghostly scent of lavender. How had she known? How had she even gotten into the trunk? He hadn't heard her. He didn't ask. The next morning, he was standing by the stove, the handkerchief in his hand. When she came out, he just looked at her, his eyes asking the question. Mariel looked at the handkerchief, then at his face. She didn't offer an explanation. She just gave him a small, slow nod, a nod of understanding. It was not pity, it was simply, I see. She understood the grief he never spoke. The final wall crumbled a week later. Carver was on the porch, staring out at the sunset, His father was buried on a small rise to the west, marked by a simple wooden cross. Carver made a point of never looking at it. It was a monument to his own failures. He felt her presence beside him. She stood next to him, following his gaze to the horizon. Then, her eyes drifted to the cross on the hill. She looked at it for a long time, then looked back at Carver's hard, set profile. She lifted her hand. He tensed, expecting her to tug his sleeve, to point, to ask a question he couldn't answer. Instead, she just touched him. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, brushed the front of his shirt, right over his heart. It was a gesture that lasted only a second. It was not a caress. It was a wordless message. I see this too. It is forgiven. He closed his eyes. He didn't pull away. A warmth, something he hadn't felt since he was a boy, started deep in his chest. It was not passion. It was not desire. It was something quieter and far more powerful. It was the feeling of being, for the first time in a decade, truly seen. It was a connection, not born of words or promises, but built slowly, in the shared silence. It was not rushed, and it was not faked. It was simply and profoundly there. A man cannot live on an island, not even one perched 700 feet above the rest of the county. Carver Wynne needed supplies. For the first time in memory, the list he'd compiled was not just for himself. He needed more flour, more beans, more coffee. He needed thread, a few yards of sturdy calico, and another tin of lard. His journey down to Buckthorn Ferry was quiet, the wagon wheels grinding the familiar track. But when he pulled up outside the general store, the town felt different. Or perhaps he was different. The rumor mill had been grinding for weeks, ever since he'd left with the girl. A town like Buckthorn Ferry survived on talk, and the silence from 7 Mile Mesa was a vacuum that gossip rushed to fill. The first whispers had started at Harrow's smithy, the forge glowing red in the dusty shade. It was the natural gathering place for men with time to wait. Saw Wynne, Harrow, the blacksmith, had said, his hammer striking a rhythmic clang against a glowing horseshoe. Comes for supplies. He ain't the same. A ranch hand, waiting for a mule to be shod, spat a stream of tobacco. It's that creature he bought, the mute. Heard she's up there living in the house with him. That ain't the half of it. Another man chimed in, leaning against a barrel. My wife's cousin, Jeb. He rides fence for the Bartee Borders Wynne's property. He saw that roan mare, the one that was auction block dead, said it's fat, sleek, said she just looked at it. Harrow paused, the hammer hovering. Looked at it. Just what he said. And his cattle. Wynne's never been a top hand with livestock. Now Jeb says his calves are fatter than Rusk's. Says he saw Wynne's brindle cow, the one that always has trouble. Looked like she was in a bad way. The girl came out, just stood by the fence, and the calf just dropped. Easy as you please. A cold silence fell in the smithy, broken only by the hiss of the hot shoe in the quenching tub. That ain't natural, Harrow said, his voice low. The word hung in the smoky air. Unnatural. Now, as Carver stepped onto the boardwalk, he felt that word following him. He entered the general store. The bell above the door jangled. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, was behind the counter, bagging sugar for another customer. Mrs. Larrabee. They were mid-conversation, their voices bright. And the fever just won't break. I tell you, I've tried everything. The moment they saw Carver, the conversation died. It didn't taper off. It was guillotined. Mrs. Gable's smile froze, her hand tightening on the scoop. A small boy of about 6, Mrs. Larrabee's son, Timothy, was playing with a wooden spool near the door. He saw Carver and, with the simple curiosity of a child, ran over. Mister, is that your wagon? You got a... Timothy, Mrs. Larrabee's voice was a sharp crack. She lunged, snatching the boy's wrist, and yanked him back, pulling him behind her skirts as if Carver were a rabid dog. "Don't you bother, mister. Win, come here." The gesture was sharp, brutal, and unmistakable. It was not protection. It was quarantine. Carver's face, shadowed by his hat, didn't change. He walked to the counter. The silence in the store was heavy, thick as molasses. He set his list down. "Mrs. Gable." Mr. Wynne." Her voice was cold. She filled his order without a word, her movement stiff. She took his money, her fingers avoiding his, and he left. The bell jangled his exit. He was loading the sacks onto his wagon when he was approached by Elder Bram Tolley. The elder was the town's unofficial moral compass, a man whose gaunt face and black frock coat gave him the air of a perpetual funeral. "Carver," Tolley said, his hands clasped behind his back. Carver nodded. "Elder, I am a man who believes in the good Lord's plan. Son, his plan is written in his book. It is known. It is spoken." Tolley's eyes bored into him. "The town, they are uneasy. They speak of things that are not known. They speak of silence, of happenings. A Christian man's home is his own, but he has a duty to his community. This woman you are harboring, it is not a natural arrangement." "She's a hard worker, elder," Carver said, tying down a sack. "Hard work is a virtue." Tolley conceded. "But what is learned in silence? Away from God's spoken word, it can be a dark path. Carver, the town is watching." Carver finished his knot. "They're welcome to," he said, and climbed onto the wagon seat. Before he could pull away, one more man stopped him. Sheriff Ephraim Pike. The sheriff was a practical man, a man who preferred to solve problems before they required paperwork or lead. He leaned against the wagon wheel, his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Wynne." "Sheriff." "I don't give a damn what you do on that mesa, you know that. You're a quiet man. You pay your taxes. But I'm gonna give you some free advice." Pike looked up and down the street, making sure they weren't overheard. "The talk is getting sharp. We've had nigh on 3 weeks of dry spell. The river's low. Cattle are getting thin. When things get dry, folks get jumpy. They start looking for reasons. They start looking for something to blame." He looked Carver square in the eye. "That girl, she's not a person to them. She's a reason, for your own good, and maybe for hers. You should send her somewhere else. The mission in Waco. Maybe get her out of this county before this turns ugly." Carver looked at the sheriff for a long moment. He saw the genuine, weary concern in the man's eyes. "She's not trouble, Sheriff," Carver said, his voice quiet. "She's just listening." He snapped the reins and the wagon pulled away, leaving Pike shaking his head in the dust. The dry spell held. The air grew thick with dust and tension. Then, the news rippled through town. The Larrabee boy, Timothy, was sick, the fever that misses. Larrabee had been complaining about had taken a dark turn. The boy was delirious. And Doc Finley was still gone. He was over in Williamson County, dealing with a typhoid outbreak, and wasn't expected back for another week. The news traveled fast. A rider from a neighboring ranch, passing 7 Mile Mesa, shouted it to Carver, who was mending fence by the road. "Larrabee boy's dying fever's got him bad. The mother's half mad with it." Carver finished twisting the wire, his movements methodical. He rode back to the ranch. Mariel was in the yard, scattering feed for the chickens. He went to the doorframe. He took the chalk. She watched him, her eyes questioning his early return. He wrote, his letters large and blocky. "Larrabee boy, bad fever. Doc Finley is gone." She read the words. Her face, usually so calm, tightened. She looked at Carver, a question in her eyes. He just nodded, confirming it. She didn't hesitate. She went not to the house, but to the small, thriving herb patch his mother had planted, the one Mariel had resurrected. Her fingers moved with purpose, picking dried lavender heads, leaves of rabbit tobacco, and a handful of feverfew. She bundled them in a clean cloth. She went to the barn. Carver followed, watching. She bridled the roan mare. The horse, once a skeleton, was now strong and steady. It nuzzled her shoulder as she slipped the bit into its mouth. She threw a blanket on its back and mounted, her basket in her arm. She looked at Carver, a clear, determined light in her eyes. He didn't try to stop her. He just grabbed his hat and his rifle, saddled his own horse, and followed her down the mesa. They arrived at the Larrabee Ranch an hour later. It was a small, dusty homestead, and a terrible thin wail could be heard from inside. Carver knocked. Mrs. Larrabee tore the door open. Her face was a white, ravaged mask. Her eyes were red from weeping, wild with terror and grief. When she saw Mariel, her expression hardened. What do you want? Get out of here." Mariel didn't flinch. She simply held out the basket of herbs. Carver stepped forward, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and gentle. "Please. She knows herbs. She helped my stock when they were sick. The doctor's gone. Maybe she can help." Mrs. Larrabee looked from Carver's earnest face to Mariel's calm one. She looked back into the dark room where her son was thrashing. She was a woman at the end of her rope. He's burning," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Nothing works." She stepped aside, a gesture of absolute defeat. Mariel entered the small, hot room. It smelled of sickness. Timothy was on the bed, his small body rigid, his eyes rolled back, muttering words without meaning. Mariel became an island of pure calm. She moved to the wash basin. She gestured to the stove. Hot water. Mrs. Larrabee, moving like a sleepwalker, brought the kettle. Mariel steeped the herbs in a bowl, and the room filled with a sharp, clean, fragrant steam. She soaked a small cloth in the warm infusion. "Warm, Mrs." Larrabee cried, her voice rising to a shriek. "He's on fire! You'll cook him!" Mariel turned. She looked the frantic mother in the eyes. She didn't smile. She just held her gaze, a look of such profound, quiet competence that Mrs. Larrabee's protest died in her throat. Mariel gently, so gently, placed the warm, damp cloth on the boy's forehead. She placed another on his small, heaving chest. She dipped her fingers in the water and rubbed the infusion onto the soles of his feet and the insides of his wrists. She did not pray. She did not chant. She just worked. She sat on a small stool by the bed, replacing the cloths as they cooled, her hand resting calmly on the boy's shoulder, as if physically holding him back from the edge. Carver stood in the doorway, his rifle held loosely at his side, a silent guard against a world that didn't understand. An hour passed, then 2. The light in the room began to fade. The boy's thrashing eased. The high, thin muttering stopped. Mariel placed her palm on Timothy's forehead, then on her own cheek, comparing. She nodded once, to herself. The boy's breathing, which had been a series of ragged, shallow gasps, deepened. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, and he was asleep, truly, deeply asleep. Mrs. Larrabee, who had been frozen against the wall, crept forward. She touched her son's cheek. The fire was gone. His skin was damp with sweat, but it was cool, cool. She let out a sound, a raw cry of relief and gratitude, and collapsed onto her knees by the bed, her head buried in the blankets, her shoulders shaking. She looked up at Mariel, her hand outstretched. "Thank you, oh God, thank you." Mariel simply touched the back of the mother's hand. A brief, light contact. Then she stood, packed her empty bowl in her cloths, and walked out of the room. Carver followed. The next day, the news was all over Buckthorn Ferry. The Larrabee boy was not dead. He was sitting up in bed, demanding soup. It was a miracle. But the reaction was not what Mrs. Larrabee expected when she went to the general store for that soup. The whispers that greeted her were not of joy. They were dark, fearful. How did she know Doc Finley uses quinine? He don't use weeds and warm cloths. My great-grandma, she was part Cherokee, she used feverfew. But that's Indian medicine. Who taught her? Why did she know it ain't natural? The gratitude of one mother was drowned out by the rising fear of the town. And that fear found a voice. Gideon Rusk. Rusk owned the biggest ranch in the county, a sprawling empire downstream from everyone else. He was a hard man, a man who saw the world in terms of profit, loss, and power. He didn't like things he couldn't control, and he did not like Carver Wynn. That week, Rusk lost a prize-winning steer. It got spooked, ran into a new strand of barbed wire, and tore its leg to the bone. It had to be shot. It was a $500 loss, and Rusk was furious. He was in the saloon, and he heard the whispers about the mute girl. I'll tell you what it is. Rusk bellowed, slamming his fist on the bar. It's a jinx. That's what she is. I was in town last week, checking my stock in the holding pens. Wynn and that girl passed by. She looked at my steer, just stared at it. It was a bald-faced lie. Mariel hadn't been to town in over a month. But it didn't matter. She put the bad eye on it? Rusk roared, his face purpling. First, she's calling lightning from a clear sky. Then she's working roots and weeds to break fevers. Now she's laming my prize stock. She's a jinx, and Wynn is harboring her. He's putting this whole county at risk. The fear finally had a name, and it had a target. It happened at dusk. 2 days later, Carver was in the barn, pitching hay into the stalls. Mariel was inside, the lamplight glowing yellow in the window. He heard them, the soft thud of many horses, walking, not trotting, the jingle of harness, muffled, the sound of men trying, and failing, to be quiet. He picked up the shotgun he always kept leaning by the door. He stepped out of the barn. They were at his front gate. It wasn't a mob. Not yet. It was a delegation. 7 or 8 men sitting on their horses, their shapes dark against the twilight. He recognized them. Mr. Nettles, from the hardware store, Harrow, the smith, and behind them, on a big black gelding, Gideon Rusk, his face a mask of cold righteousness. Several of them carried unlit torches. The message was unmistakable. Mr. Nettles rode forward, twisting his hat in his hands. He was the spokesman. Carver, we ain't looking for trouble. Then you've ridden to the wrong house, Nettles. Carver said. His voice was flat, carrying in the still air. Now, you listen. Carver, the town's concerned. There's been happenings, unnatural things. That girl, the Fever Rusk steer. It ain't right. Carver, she's a disturbance. We're here, as neighbors, to ask you to send her away. Send her where? Anywhere. Rusk's voice cut in, sharp as glass. Put her on a wagon and send her downriver. She's property. You got no right to keep her a thing like that here, to plague the rest of us. And if I say no, we'll come back, Rusk said simply, and we won't be asking. The cabin door opened. Mariel stepped out onto the porch. She stood in the rectangle of lamplight, her hands clasped at her waist. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the men's postures. She could see the unlit torches. She did not move. She just watched. Carver looked at the men on their horses. He saw their fear, their ignorance. He saw Rusk's cold, calculating malice. He looked back at Mariel, a small, straight figure, bathed in light, alone. He stepped away from the barn, out into the middle of the yard. Placing himself between the men and his house, his beard was dark in the gloom. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it was filled with a cold iron that stopped every man there. She is not a thing, and she is not a jinx. He looked at Nettles. He looked at Harrow. His gaze swept over every one of them. For 10 years, he said, his voice vibrating with a contained power. "I have lived on this mesa, alone. None of you," he jabbed a finger, "have ridden to my gate. None of you have shared a cup of coffee. I have been as silent to you as she is." He took a step toward them. "You are the deaf ones. All of you. You listen to gossip in a saloon. You listen to fear in a dry spell. You listen to him." He jerked his chin at Rusk. "That woman," he said, turning his head toward the porch, "is the only person who has ever truly listened to me. She listens with her hands. She listens with her breath. She listens with her soul. She has more humanity in her than this entire delegation." He settled the shotgun in the crook of his arm. It was not a threat. It was a statement. "She stays. That is my final word. Get off my land." The men were stunned. They had come to bully a strange, lonely rancher. They had found something else. They had found a man made of bedrock. They looked at each other, their righteous anger suddenly feeling cheap and small. They looked at Marielle on the porch, not cowering, but watching them with that same terrible, calm gaze from the auction block. "Mister," Nettles was the first to break. He put his hat back on his head. He's right. Gideon, this is his property. This ain't the law." He turned his horse, his face ashamed. Harrow followed. "Aye, this ain't right." One by one, the delegation dissolved. The men peeled off, avoiding Rusk's eyes, and trotted away, their torches unlit. Gideon Rusk was left alone, his face pale with fury. He stared at Carver, a look of pure, concentrated hatred. He looked at the house, at the woman, at the ranch. "This ain't over. When?" he spat. He wheeled his horse, dug his spurs in, and galloped into the darkness. The yard was silent, the only sound the chirping of crickets. Carver stood for a long time, until the last hoofbeat faded. He let out a long breath. He walked to the house. He props the shotgun against the wall inside the door. The room was warm. Marielle was at the stove. The air smelled of apples and cinnamon. She had a pot of mulled cider heating on the coals. She ladled a steaming mug and handed it to him. He took it, their hands brushed. His was steady. He set the mug on the table. He didn't speak. She didn't write. He looked at her, and she looked at him. In her eyes, he didn't see fear. He saw a shared understanding. He turned his hand over, palm up, and held it out. She looked at his calloused, open hand. Then she looked at his face, slowly. She placed her hand in his. It was small and chapped, but it was warm. He closed his fingers around it. It was a pact, a silent, binding oath. We are in this together. The next morning, Carver rose before dawn. He walked to the door and stopped. There was a new message on the chalkboard, written in her neat hand. Today the wind is kind. He read it. He opened the door. The air was cool and clean. It was kind. The words felt like a small blessing, a charm against the hate. He saddled his horse to ride the fence line, half expecting to find a cut wire or a lame horse. He rode to the main gate, where the track met the county road. He stopped. Sitting on the ground, just inside the gate, were 2 glass jars of blackberry jam and a neatly folded linen cloth. There was no note. He dismounted. He picked up the jars. They were still slightly warm. He looked toward the town, invisible beyond the ridge. He smiled, a small, grim quirk of his lips. Gideon Rusk hadn't convinced everyone. Mrs. Larrabee had a voice, too. The town was no longer completely afraid. It was just watching and waiting. The fence on the far western edge of the 7-mile mesa had been bothering Carver for a week. It was the most vulnerable line, the one that bordered the lowlands where Gideon Rusk's territory began. After the confrontation at his gate, Carver had taken to riding it every 2 days, his rifle heavy in its scabbard. Autumn was sharpening, turning its back on the sun. The air had a new bite, and the ground, which had been powder dry for months, was now hard as iron. slick with morning frost. He was riding his old gray gelding, a steady, dependable mount, checking the tension of the wires. He dismounted to restaple a loose section to a juniper post, his movements efficient in the cold. He was remounting when it happened. The gray, usually as placid as a stone, suddenly shied, its eyes white. A rattlesnake, coiled and sluggish in the cold, had let out a warning buzz from a rock just inches from the horse's hoof. The horse didn't bolt. It leaped, a sideways, twisting jump on the uneven, rocky ground. Carver, half in the saddle, was thrown off balance. He tried to pull the horse's head to control the fall, but its stumble was too violent. He went down, his full weight landing on his right shoulder, his head narrowly missing a granite boulder. A white, blinding fire exploded behind his eyes. It was a pain so total, so absolute, that it stole his breath. He lay in the frost-covered dirt, gasping, the world spinning in a nauseating gray blur. The gray gelding, terrified, had scrambled a few yards away and stood trembling, its reins dragging. Carver lay still for a long minute, just breathing. He knew this kind of pain. It wasn't the sharp, clean snap of a broken bone. It was something deeper, a tearing, wrenching agony. He tried to move his right arm. Nothing. The limb was useless, a dead weight, and the attempt sent a fresh wave of sickness through him. He was 4 miles from the house. Gritting his teeth, he rolled to his knees, his left arm shaking from the strain. He got one foot under him. He looked at the horse, which was watching him, its ears pricked. "Easy, boy," Carver grated, his voice a raw whisper. "Easy." He spent 10 agonizing minutes coaxing the horse, using only his left hand and his voice, until he could grab the reins. Getting into the saddle was a new kind of hell. He had to haul himself up using only his left arm and leg, the movement sending jolts of pure fire through his shoulder and down his back. He nearly blacked out. He finally slumped over the saddle horn, his right arm hanging limp, and nudged the gray into a walk. The ride back was a blur. Every jolt, every step the horse took, was a fresh torment. The world narrowed to a single point of focus, the trail, the pain, and the image of the small cabin. Cold sweat dripped from his hair, stinging his eyes. Though the air was near freezing, he must have been a sight, pale as ash, slumped over his horse, his hat gone, his face a mask of gritted endurance. He saw the cabin through a haze. He saw her. Marielle was on the porch, sweeping. She had a way of sweeping, rhythmic and thorough, that he had come to associate with the new, clean quiet of the ranch. She looked up, as she always did when she felt the vibration of his return. She saw him. The broom dropped from her hands. It clattered on the wooden planks. And for a half-second, she was frozen, her hand still in the air. He didn't see her move. She just flew. She was off the porch and across the yard in a silent, desperate sprint, her skirts tangled in her legs. He was trying to dismount, but his body wouldn't obey. His vision was tunneling. He slid, more than climbed, from the saddle, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth, his knees buckled. He didn't hit the ground. She was there, her small, wiry body slamming into his side, catching him. She got her shoulder under his good arm, wrapping her other arm around his waist, her grip astonishingly strong. She took his full, leaning weight. He gasped, his head dropping, his face pressed into her hair. It smelled of wood smoke and the wild mint she used. He felt the frantic, warm puff of her breath against the cold skin of his neck. It was the first time they had ever touched like this, not with a hand, but with their whole bodies. It was desperate, and it was terribly, shockingly intimate. "It's just the shoulder," he managed to whisper, as if she could hear him. "I'm all right." She didn't hear the words, but she felt the lie. She ignored him, her face a mask of pale, fierce concentration, and began the slow, agonizing haul to the house. He collapsed into the heavy oak chair by the stove. the one that had been his father's. The world swam. He was vaguely aware of her moving around him, a blur of focused energy. He was cold, so cold, but his shoulder was on fire. She was back in front of him. She had to get the heavy canvas coat off. He tried to help with his left hand, but the coat was stiff, and moving his torso was agony. Her hands, which he had only known to be calm and steady, were trembling. Not with fear, but with a fine, urgent tremor. She didn't pull or yank. Her fingers worked at the buttons. Then she gently, so gently, maneuvered the stiff fabric off his good arm. And then, with excruciating care, slid the coat from his ruined shoulder. He hissed, his teeth clenched, as the heavy, dragging weight pulled at the joint. The shirt beneath was torn, the canvas bloody from where he'd hit the ground. She looked at it, then at him. Her eyes were wide, dark with a concern so profound it momentarily eclipsed his pain. She went to the stove, poured water from the kettle into the tin basin. She tested it with her fingers, adding cold water from the pump until it was exactly, perfectly warm. She knelt at his feet. Setting the basin on the floor, she took a clean rag and dipped it, wringing it out. Her hands were shaking. He could see the small, uncontrollable quivers in her fingers. He found himself watching her. Not the wound. He was transfixed. He watched the way her slender wrist turned as she wrung the cloth. He watched her lips. The lower one caught between her teeth in a gesture of such intense concentration, he felt his own breath hitch. She was afraid. Not of him. She was afraid for him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. She began to clean the wound. Her touch was impassandi light. She washed away the blood and the grit from the scrapes on his arm and collarbone. Her touch feather-light. Clinical, yet overwhelmingly tender. When she had to clean near the joint itself, she saw him wince. His eyes squeezed shut. She stopped. Her hand hovered. He opened his eyes. She was looking at his face, her own a mirror of his pain. He gave a small, jerky nod. "Go on." She finished. She retrieved her small wooden box of herbs and salves. She took a dark, fragrant balm comfrey. He thought he smelled and applied it with her fingertips, her touch so gentle it barely registered. Then she bandaged him. She'd found clean linen strips, torn from an old sheet. She worked with a new focus, the trembling in her hands lessening as the task took over. She wrapped him, her movements efficient, binding his arm to his chest to keep it immobile. She was wrapping him, securing him, holding him together. He sat there, breathing through the dull, heavy throb, and just watched. He watched her hands move. He watched the fall of her straw-colored hair as she bent. He watched the rise and fall of her shoulders. She finished, tying the last knot with a firm tug. She knelt there for a second, her hands still resting on her work, on his chest. Her face was very close to his injured shoulder. She looked at the clean white bandage, then at the angry, bruised skin above it, then at his face. He was still watching her. A silent moment passed. The only sound was the crackle of the stove and the low, rising moan of the wind outside. Then she did something that stopped his heart. She leaned in, her hair brushing his chin. She didn't look at his lips. She didn't look at his eyes. She looked at the bandage, and she pressed a kiss, soft, warm, and brief, onto the clean linen, just beside the worst of the bruising. It was not a bold gesture. It was not a kiss of passion. It was an impulse, a prayer, a wordless, desperate thank you that he was alive, that he had come home. It was a seal. It sent a shock through Carver's system that had nothing to do with pain. It was a jolt of warmth, a current of pure, unadulterated life. It chased the cold from his bones and made the pain in his shoulders seem very far away. She pulled back, her cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. She met his gaze. Her eyes were damp. He sat there, pinned to the chair, his heart thundering against his ribs, louder than the ache in his arm. He had to say something. He had to answer her, but his voice was gone, and she could not hear. He gestured, an awkward, clumsy motion with his left hand, toward the doorframe. She understood immediately. She rose, fetched the nub of chalk, and brought it to him. He took it. His left hand was clumsy, unused to the task. He reached out to the doorframe, his arms shaking with the effort and the lingering shock. He wrote, the letters large and uneven. I want to hear your heart with my heart. She stepped back, her eyes reading the words. She read them once, then twice. She lifted her hand and her fingers, the same fingers that had bandaged him, traced the chalky letters on the wood, as if she could absorb the meaning through her skin. A small, slow smile touched her lips. It was not the full, brilliant smile he would see later, but a small, private, dawning thing. She turned to him. She didn't hesitate. She stepped close, inside his guard, and placed her right palm flat on his chest, on his left side, directly over his thundering heart. Her hand was warm. The simple, profound contact made him stop breathing. He let out a long, shuddering breath and, with his good left hand, he covered hers. His large, calloused hand completely enveloped her small one. And they just stood there. The silence in the room became thick, heavy, and sweet, like honey warmed by the fire. The only sounds were the crackle of the pine in the stove and the rising shriek of the wind outside. It was a sound he'd always associated with loneliness. Now, it just sounded far away. He could feel the steady, living warmth of her hand seeping through his shirt, warming his skin, calming the frantic beat of his heart. She leaned in, her body close and gently. She rested her head against his good shoulder. He instinctively tilted his own head, resting it against the top of hers. His cheek brushed her soft hair. Shoulder to shoulder, head to head, his hand covering hers, her hand on his heart. They stood, and then she slowly sank to sit on the hearthrug at his feet, never breaking the contact. He remained in the chair, and she sat beside his knee, her head now resting against his thigh, her hand still held in his. He closed his eyes. He felt his heartbeat slow down. He felt the tension from the fall, the pain, the fear, just drain away. He swore. In that moment, he could feel the faint, answering pulse from the hand under his, their heartbeats, finding a shared, quiet rhythm. Night fell. The wind, which had been moaning, turned into a roar. With it came the first snow of the winter. Not a gentle dusting, but a heavy, driving curtain of white that lashed the small window pane and began to seal the cabin from the outside world. The room grew cold. Mariel stirred. She looked at Carver. He was stiff with pain, and she knew he couldn't get to his cot. He couldn't stay in the chair all night in the freezing cold. She rose. She banked the fire, adding 2 heavy logs that would burn slow and hot. She retrieved the thickest wool blanket from his cot, the one his mother had woven. She came back to the hearth. He sat, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out. She sat down beside him, on his good left side, so close their hips and shoulders touched. She unfolded the heavy blanket and draped it over both of them, tucking it in around their shoulders, cocooning them in a shared nest of warmth. They sat in the flickering firelight, the blizzard raging outside, 2 quiet figures in a small, warm cave. He turned his head to look at her. She was already looking at him. Her face, softened by the fire, was open, her eyes clear. He leaned in, his movement slow, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not turn away. She leaned toward him. He kissed her. It was not like the kiss on the bandage. This was intentional. It was slow, and it was deep, but it was incredibly gentle. It was a kiss of questions, not demands. His lips were chapped from the cold. Hers were soft and warm. It was a discovery, a shared breath in the quiet dark. They kissed for a long moment, a slow exploration. Then they pulled back, just inches, breathing the same air. He looked at her. A small, shy smile touched her lips, and she let out a silent, breathy laugh. He smiled back, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. He kissed her again, and this time, her hand, the one not trapped between them, came up to cup his jaw, her thumb brushing his beard. He found he needed to talk. He needed to fill the silence, not with noise, but with truth. He leaned his forehead against hers, his good arm holding her close under the blanket, and he whispered, "I was so ashamed." He breathed, his voice a low rumble, a vibration she could feel. He talked, his voice quiet, telling her things he had never told another soul. He told her about his father, about the land, about the failure. This place, it was a monument to what we lost. I didn't see what it could be. She couldn't hear the words, but she didn't need to. She watched his lips. She watched the pain and the confession in his eyes. She listened with her entire being. Their hands were clasped under the blanket, and as he spoke, her thumb began to draw slow, soothing circles on the back of his hand. She was listening. She was understanding. She was forgiving. They did not cross any forbidden lines. Theirs was an intimacy built of shared survival, of silent understanding, and now, of profound, tender care. The passion was there, blazing in the way he held her, in the way she looked at him, in the way they held each other just a little longer, a single breath deeper, after each slow, gentle kiss. It was an embrace of safety. It was an embrace of respect. The fire burned down to glowing coals. The blizzard softened. The wind's roar fading to a sigh. The cabin was filled with a gray, pre-dawn light. They had not slept, but had dozed in that warm, safe cocoon, lulled by the storm and their own quiet breathing. She stirred, leaning back to look at him. His face was gray with exhaustion, his beard rough, his eyes heavy, but he was looking at her with a clarity, a warmth, that made her breath catch. She leaned in, and this time, she just rested her forehead against his, skin to skin. He felt the words well up, a truth so simple and so absolute, it was like the bedrock of the mesa itself. He said it, his voice a low whisper, a vibration that traveled from his bones to hers. "You belong here, Mariel." She pulled back, her eyes wide. She had read his lips. She had heard him. And she smiled. It was not the small, shy smile he had seen by the fire. It was not the tight, concentrated look he saw when she worked. This was the sun. It started in her eyes, lighting them from within, and it transformed her entire face. It was a smile of such total, unbridled, soul-deep joy that it struck him speechless. It was the smile of a person who had been lost and had just been told, finally, that she was home. He just stared at her, his heart aching with a feeling he couldn't name. The gray light turned to a pale, pearlescent pink. The snow had stopped. "The animals," he said, his voice rough. She nodded. She helped him, gently, to his feet. He was stiff, and his shoulder was a universe of dull pain, but he could move. They bundled up, him awkwardly fumbling with his coat, her helping him, her movements now sure and familiar. He stepped onto the porch. The world was new. A foot of pristine white snow covered everything, muffling the world in a perfect, bright silence. The air was clean and cold, and the rising sun set the snow-covered hills on fire with pink and gold. He walked to the barn, his boots making the first tracks. Mariel was right beside him. He reached for the heavy wooden latch of the barn door with his good left hand. At the exact same moment, she reached for it, too. Their hands met on the cold, snow-dusted wood. His fingers found hers. He didn't just touch them. He interlaced his, clasping her hand in his, together, as one. They slid the heavy door open, letting a shaft of golden light fall onto the grateful, waiting animals inside. The warmth of their clasped hands lingered, a promise against the cold. This was not a love of sudden fire. It was a love built of daily, deliberate choices. It was etched in shared work, in quiet understanding, and in a profound, mutual act of saving. It was a love built on care and held firm by self-control. And it was stronger than any storm. The snow melted, and the world of 7 Mile Mesa turned from white to a vibrant, living green. The high country spring was a sudden, violent explosion of life, and with it came a new kind of work. Carver's shoulder healed, the deep ache fading to a stiff memory, but his reliance on his left arm had forged a new dexterity, and with the new season, a new language began to form between them, born of necessity and a deep, unfolding tenderness. It began one evening by the fire. Carver had been trying to explain, through a series of clumsy gestures, that the water barrel by the barn was low. He pointed. He mimed, drinking. He made a gesture for low. Marielle watched him, her head tilted, a small, amused smile playing on her lips. She finally held up her hand, a quiet signal for him to stop. She took his hand. She cupped her own, as if holding water, and brought it to her lips. She tapped her own mouth twice. Water. Then she held her other hand up, fingers together, and wiggled them. A small, flickering motion. Fire. Carver watched, fascinated. He copied the gestures. Water, fire. She smiled, a full, bright smile that lit her face. She then placed her hand over her heart and moved it forward, palm up, in a small, gentle offering. He knew, instantly, what it meant. Thank you. He found his own hand clumsy, his calloused fingers thick as he tried to copy her. Thank you. Her fingers, which he had once thought of as frail, were like willow leaves, quick, precise, and expressive. She taught him horse, eat, work, sleep, and he taught her. He mouthed the words slowly, clearly, as she made the signs, so she could connect the shape of his mouth to the movement of her hands. Their world expanded. His language was of the ranch. He decided it was time she learned to ride properly, not just sit on the placid roan mare. He saddled his own steady bay, a horse with a gentler mouth. This is, he mouthed, pointing at the saddle horn. Horn. She looked at it, then at him, her eyes wide with a nervousness he hadn't seen since the auction. She was not afraid of lightning. She was not afraid of angry men, but this new skill, this reliance on a 1,000-pound animal, this was different. He helped her up. Her first instinct was to clutch the saddle horn, her knuckles white, her body rigid. No, he said, his voice gentle. He stood beside her, his good hand on her knee, his thumb pressing gently. Feel the horse. He walked the horse, leading it, his hand still on her leg, letting her feel the rhythm. Move with him, he mouthed. He showed her, exaggerating the rock of his own hips. Breathe, let go. She was a creature of breath and rhythm. She understood that. He watched the transformation. He saw her shoulders, which were hunched up by her ears, visibly drop. Her death grip on the horn loosened. Her hips, which had been fighting the motion, began to sway, catching the cadence of the horse's walk. A look of pure, astonished delight broke across her face. She was moving with him. She was part of the animal. He smiled, a deep, proud smile, and handed her the reins. They began to build. The cabin was small, meant for one man's solitude. It was not enough for 2 lives. The small, windowless storage room where she slept was little more than a closet. We need, he wrote on the doorframe one morning, more space. He had a stack of good, seasoned pine left over from a mended corral. With his shoulder now strong enough for light work, he began to frame out a small addition on the sheltered, eastern side of the cabin. It was slow going, him doing the heavy sawing and lifting, but she was his second hand, his shadow. Her movements quick and precise. She held the planks. She drove the pegs. She learned to use the hammer, her initial clumsy strokes becoming sure and rhythmic. She was not just helping. She was designing. She pointed to the wall. Window, a big one, facing the sunrise. She gestured to the interior wall. Shelves, many shelves. When it was done, it was more than a room. It was hers. He moved her small cot under the new, bright window. He built her a sturdy oak chair, and she placed the old, worn rug his mother had made on the floor. Her shelves filled, not with trinkets, but with the tools of her trade, dozens of small, tied bundles of herbs, glass jars of salves, neatly coiled linen bandages. It was a room for working, for thinking, for healing. It became known, in his mind, as the listening room. It was from there, through that new window, that she would watch the world and record its secrets. The chalkboard on the door frame, once a place for single words, became the ranch's living journal. Carver would rise, drink his coffee, and go to the door to read the day's orders, the day's predictions. The clouds are low on the southern ridge. Move the sheep to the high pasture before noon. Rain will come by 3. And it did. A sudden, drenching shower that started, as if on a clock, at 5 minutes past 3, while the sheep were safe on high, dry ground. The black-horned cow, number 12, is off her feed. She is not chewing her cud. Check on her this evening. Her left eye is weeping. He'd gone out, and sure enough, found a thistle burr caught deep in the cow's eyelid, an irritation that would have festered. That would have cost him the animal. The vines on the north fence are twisting to the west. The wind will shift before night. It will be a cold wind. Bring the new calf in. He learned to trust these observations as much as he trusted the sun. He began to see what she saw. He would stand on the porch and sniff the air, and for the first time, he could smell it, too, the scent of damp earth hours before the rain. He would look at the sky and see, not just blue, but the quality of the blue, the way the light hit the dust, and know the air was changing. He was learning her language, the language of the earth, and it was making him a better rancher. It was also making him a different man. Their evenings changed. The work was done. The animals fed. The doors barred. The fire would be lit, and they would sit. The silence was no longer a void, but a shared, comfortable space. It was in those long, fire-lit hours that they truly began to talk. He would speak slowly, his back to the light so his face was illuminated. "I'm glad you are here." He would exaggerate the movement of his lips, feeling foolish, but she would watch, her brow furrowed in concentration. Then she would repeat the words, her voice rusty from disuse, the sounds soft, breathy, like the first stirrings of a bird. "Glad, here." Sometimes they would get it wrong. He tried to tell her the flour sack is empty. She squinted, her head tilted. And then, with a look of complete confusion, she signed flour and sad. He stared, then understood. He burst out laughing, a real deep laugh that shook his shoulders. She saw his laughter, saw the mistake, and she laughed too. A silent, shaking laugh, her hand covering her mouth. In that shared, ridiculous moment, the last wall between them dissolved. He was no longer her protector, and she was no longer his dependent. They were just Carver and Marielle, laughing by a fire. One evening, she took his heavy canvas coat from the peg by the door. It was still torn from his fall, the shoulder seam ripped, the fabric frayed. He had been meaning to patch it, but had never found the time. She sat in her new chair, in the pool of lamplight from the listening room, and began to work. She did not use simple thread. She took a piece of soft, supple deerskin he had tanned 2 summers ago. She cut a neat, round patch. With a sharp awl, she punched tiny, precise holes, and with a heavy needle and waxed linen thread, she began to stitch. He sat across from her, pretending to read a week-old newspaper, but he was just watching her. He watched the lamplight catch the pale gold of her hair. He watched the intense, focused line of her mouth. He watched the rhythmic, efficient power in her hands. She finished. She held it up, inspecting the seam. Then she looked at him and nodded, satisfied. "It is done."
"Let me see,"
he mouthed. He shrugged into the coat. It felt different. The patch on the shoulder was not a clumsy, rough mend. It was smooth, strong, and perfectly fitted. He moved his arm, the one she had healed, and the leather flexed with him. She got up and came over to him. She didn't ask. Her hands just came up, smoothing the new patch on his shoulder, her thumbs brushing the linen stitches. She fussed with the collar, turning it down, then stepped back, her hands on her hips. Her eyes were shining with a simple, profound pride. A pride in her work, a pride in him. He felt it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coat. "Thank you," he said, and he made the sign, his hand over his heart, offering it to her. She smiled and made the sign back. "You are welcome." The ranch, his place of lonely exile, was becoming a home. They built a bench together. They found a long, thick plank of cottonwood, sanded it smooth, and set it on two sturdy log legs under the shade of the big cottonwood tree at the edge of the yard. It became their place. In the late afternoons, when the day's heat had broken, they would sit. She would bring a tin cup of cool mint tea, and they would watch the shadows stretch across the mesa. He would whittle a piece of pine, the shavings falling around his boots. She would braid sweetgrass, her fingers flying, her eyes on the horizon. They didn't need to talk. The silence was full. It was the sound of two people building a life. The town, which had seemed so far away, began to creep closer. The change started with Mrs. Larrabee, who left a jar of corn relish on the gate every second Tuesday. Then one day, a wagon rattled up the Mesa Road. It was Silas Davies, a small rancher from the lowlands. His wife, Martha, was at his side, her face pale. "Mr. Wynne," Silas said, his hat in his hands, not getting down from the wagon. I heard well. My Martha here, she heard that your missus she's good with wounds." Carver looked at Marielle. She had come out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "My boy, Jacob," Silas stammered. He fell on a pitchfork. It's bad. Mr. Wynne, it's deep in his leg. Doc Finley's in Waco for a week. We cleaned it, but the swelling, it's red, all the way up his leg." Carver's blood went cold. He knew what red lines meant. Marielle didn't wait for a translation. She had seen the panic. She had seen the wagon. She walked straight to Silas, looked at his face, and then pointed to the back of the wagon, to the boy lying on a mattress, his face beaded with sweat. She held up one hand. "Wait." She disappeared into the listening room. She came back with her box of salves, clean linen, and a small, dark bottle. She climbed into the back of the wagon without a word of permission. Carver and Silas stood by the wagon wheel. For an hour, they heard nothing but the boy's occasional sharp hiss of pain and the low, comforting murmur of Mrs. Davies. Marielle climbed back out. Her hands were stained. She looked at Silas. She held up her empty bottle. She pointed to it, then to the boy. Then she mimed drinking. "Give him this." She had written instructions on a piece of paper. Boil water. Add 10 drops, 3 times a day. She had given them her entire supply of willow bark tincture. Silas Davies just stared at her, his jaw working. We got no money, ma'am. Not till we sell the calves." Marielle just shook her head. She looked at the boy, then at the mother, and she touched Mrs. Davies's arm. A brief, reassuring squeeze. The wagon rattled away. 3 days later, Silas was back. He didn't come to the house. He just left a freshly dressed quarter of mutton hanging on the porch hook. The whispers in Buckthorn Ferry began to change. The fear, The talk of jinxes and the bad eye was replaced by a new, reluctant curiosity. Old widow Albee, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words since her husband died 2 years prior, was seen walking up the Mesa Road. She sat with Mariel on the cottonwood bench for a whole afternoon. They just sat. The widow left, and Mrs. Gable at the general store swore she saw the old woman humming. The people who had come with unlit torches now came, one by one, with hats in their hands, a torn shoulder from a branding, a new mother who couldn't get her baby to sleep, a man grieving his wife. Mariel heard them all. She offered salves, she offered tinctures, she offered bandages, but mostly, she offered her quiet, profound, validating silence. She would just sit, her eyes on their face, and listen. The town began to call her the good listener. The malice had faded. But Gideon Rusk had not. Carver was in town, loading his wagon, when Sheriff Pike approached. The sheriff's demeanor was no longer weary and warning. It was grim. "Carver," Pike said, his voice low, "not for public consumption. Enjoying your newfound popularity, I see." Carver nodded, tying a rope. "People are just people, Ephraim." "Some are," Pike agreed, "and some are Gideon Rusk." Carver stopped. "What's he done?" "He's not a stupid man. Carver, he's not going to come at you with torches again. That's not his way. He's been in Old Waco, at the land office, and at the bank." Pike leaned in. "He's buying up land, all the scrubland to your north. He bought the old hemlock parcel to your east. He's boxing you in." "It's just scrub," Carver said. "He can have it." "It's not about the land," Pike said, his voice sharp. "It's about the water. You know that spring on your land, the one that feeds your creek? It's the headwaters for the whole lower valley. The main aquifer surfaces right on your property." Carver felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Rusk is making a legal play," Pike continued. "He's claiming that the public access clause on those old deeds gives him rights to that water. He's trying to get a judge to grant him access. He's trying to build a new sluice, to divert that water before it ever gets to your corrals. He's going to dry you out. Carver, he's going to choke you right off that mesa, and he's going to use the law to do it." Carver finished his knot. He looked at the sheriff. "He'll have to come through me." "He knows that," Pike said, his face grim. "That's exactly what he's counting on." The night was wrong. It was late autumn, and the air should have been cold and sharp, the stars brittle. Instead, a heavy, humid stillness had fallen over the mesa, suffocating the land. The air was dead, and the silence was so profound it had a weight to it. Carver was deep asleep, the bone-tired sleep of a man who had spent the day digging post holes. He didn't hear the change. Mariel felt it. She didn't wake up. She snapped awake. She was sitting bolt upright in her cot in the listening room before her eyes were even open, her heart pounding a frantic, warning rhythm. The silence was gone. In its place, she felt a low, subsonic vibration. The house was humming, a deep thrum of a plucked string. She was out of the cot, her bare feet on the cold plank floor. Carver was just beginning to stir, roused by her sudden movement. "Mariel, what?" She was at the main wall of the cabin, her palm pressed flat against the central timber beam. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of concentration. He was out of his own bed now, his senses catching up. He could hear it, a low, rising moan, like a distant train, and he could feel it, a vibration in the soles of his feet. Mariel's eyes flew open. She looked at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a command that needed no translation. The house didn't just vibrate. It groaned, a deep, agonizing sound of wood under impossible, twisting pressure. The windows rattled, then bowed inward. The moan became a shriek, a sound so high and so loud it felt like a spike being driven into his ears. Mariel grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in like talons, pulling him toward the door. She didn't have to sign. Her terror was a language he understood perfectly. He ripped his heavy coat from the peg, shoved his feet into his boots. She hauled the door open, and the world exploded. They were hit by a solid wall of wind and water. It wasn't rain. It was a horizontal flood, a force so powerful it threw them both back against the cabin wall. Carver, his arm instinctively around Marielle, shielded her as the wind tried to tear them from the porch. "The barn!" he roared, but the sound was stolen from his mouth. The animals. They ran, heads down, into the black, screaming chaos. It was a fight for every step. The air was full of flying debris, leaves and branches that stung their faces like buckshot. The barn was a place of terror. The horses were screaming, a high-pitched, terrified sound. They were kicking the stall doors, the impacts thudding like drumbeats against the roar of the storm. The whole building was shaking, the timbers groaning in chorus with the house. Carver fought the main door bar, the wood slick with water. He shoved it open, and they fell inside, into the warm, animal-scented panic. Marielle didn't go to the horses. She ran to the massive central rafter, the one that held the roof, and slapped her palm against it. She listened. Carver looked up. In the slivers of lightning that flashed through the cracks, he could see the roof. It was lifting, bowing up and down like a giant, breathing thing. Marielle turned to him. Her face was white. She didn't point to the main door. She pointed to the low, narrow side door, the one they used for mucking out. She signed, her hands a desperate blur. "Horses out, now!" There was no time for halters, no time for gentle words. This was survival. Their movements became a rhythm, a desperate, shared drumbeat. He ripped open the first stall. She ripped open the second. "Latch! Shove!" His gelding, wild-eyed, refused to move. Carver didn't plead. He got behind it and struck its rump with his open hand, shouting, driving it forward. Latch, shove. Marielle was at the roan mare's head. The horse, her horse, was trembling, paralyzed by the noise. She didn't pull. She put her face to the horse's, her breath hot, forcing her own calm into the animal, and dragged it forward by the mane. They shoved the panicked animals, one by one, out the low side door, into the relative safety of the open, driving rain. The last horse scrambled through. Carver and Marielle stood in the center aisle, their lungs burning, their ears ringing. They were standing in the exact spot where the stalls had been. Crack! The sound was absolute, a deafening explosion of wood that Carver felt in his teeth. The central rafter, the one Marielle had touched, snapped. It didn't break. It disintegrated. The entire roof collapsed inward. Tons of timber, shingles, and rainwater crashed down, annihilating the stalls, crushing the very ground where they and the horses had stood just seconds before. The barn, their fortress, was gone, reduced to a pile of splintered, sodden wreckage. They were thrown to their knees by the shock wave, shielded only by the low, sturdy frame of the side door. Splinters of wood rained down around them. Wind and water poured in, unobstructed. They were alive. They were alive in a pocket of stillness, staring at total destruction. But the storm wasn't finished. A bolt of lightning, blue-white and blinding, struck the west knoll. It was followed by an instantaneous boom that shook the ground. Carver smelled it before he saw it. Ozone and smoke. "The hay!" he yelled. The lightning had struck the massive hayrick, the winter's feed, piled high and dry. A small, orange tongue of flame licked at the side, fed by the furious wind. They didn't speak, they moved. Carver sprinted toward the wagon, fighting the wind. He grabbed the heavy, oiled canvas tarp. The wind caught it, a giant sail, nearly ripping his healed shoulder from its socket. He roared, a sound of pure defiance, and wrestled it, using his weight to pin it, smothering the new flames. Marielle was not behind him. She was at the tool shed. She had the shovel. She wasn't fighting the fire. She was fighting the ground. She began to dig. She wasn't getting buckets of water in a flood. She was containing. She drove the shovel into the sodden, muddy earth, heaving massive spadefuls of mud and wet grass. She threw it onto the smoking edges of the tarp, sealing it, cutting off the air. Dig, lift, throw. Dig, lift, throw. It was a frantic, desperate rhythm, matched by Carver, who was stomping and packing the mud she threw, sealing the edges against the wind. The fire hissed, steamed, died. The hay was safe. But the rain had become a new enemy. The sound of the wind was joined by a deeper roar. The creek, the dry arroyo that cut through the lower pasture. The calves. He grabbed Marielle's hand, and they ran. The arroyo was no longer a dry ditch. It was a raging, muddy river, 6 feet deep and 20 feet wide. The new spring calves, the ones born in the listening room, were trapped. They were pressed against the far fence line, the brown, churning water already swirling around their bellies, their high-pitched, terrified bawling just barely audible over the storm. Carver didn't pause. He plunged in. The water was ice. The mud at the bottom sucked at his boots, trying to pull him down. The current slammed into his legs, a liquid wall. He reached the first calf. It was small, maybe 70 pounds, but in its panic, it was a flailing, sharp-hoofed thing. He grabbed it, hoisted it over his shoulder, and began the agonizing fight back. He slipped, went to one knee, the muddy water surging to his chest, but he didn't let go. He reached the bank and half threw the calf onto the high ground. Marielle was there. She was already working. She had ripped open 3 dry burlap sacks. She wasn't just drying the trembling animal. She was attacking it, her hands a blur, rubbing it down with a fierce, rough motion, forcing the blood to the surface, her own breath a visible cloud as she rubbed its chest, its legs, its ears. She was saving its life. Carver went back in. 1, 2, 3 more times. Each trip was a fresh hell. The water was higher. The mud was thicker. On the last trip, the smallest calf was swept from its feet. Carver lunged, catching it by a leg, and hauled it to his chest, fighting the current that was trying to rip them both away. He shoved the last shivering creature into Marielle's arms. And then, as if a switch had been thrown, the storm broke. The wind, which had been a solid, screaming entity, dropped to a howl, then a moan. The rain slowed, the horizontal sheets becoming a steady, cold downpour. They stood in the mud, by the fence line, soaked to the skin, covered in filth, shivering. They were surrounded by the wreckage of their ranch. They stumbled back to the remains of the barn, to the small, sheltered corner by the side door that had, impossibly, held. They collapsed onto the wet straw, their backs against the one remaining wall, their legs sprawled in front of them. For a long time, there was no sound but their own ragged, gasping breaths. Steam rose from their soaking clothes, visible in the pale, gray light of the false dawn. Carver looked at the hole where his roof had been. He looked at the mud-filled pasture. He looked at the shivering, saved calves. He turned his head. Marielle was leaning against the wall beside him. Her hair was matted, her face streaked with mud and soot from the hay fire. She looked like a drowned thing. She was looking at him. A slow, exhausted, painful smile stretched across his face. She smiled back. It was not her bright, sun-filled smile. It was a grim, weary smile of shared survival. He let out a short, rough bark of a laugh. Her shoulders shook in a silent echo. He was so tired. He leaned his head back against the rough wood. She did the same, their heads, heavy with exhaustion, tilted toward each other. For a brief, unconscious moment, their foreheads touched, a warm, solid, living contact in the cold. It was not a caress. It was an acknowledgement. We are here. We are alive. The sun rose on a county that looked like it had been scoured by a vengeful god. News traveled on the wind. The Larrabee's new windmill was a twisted ruin. Gideon Rusk's lower pastures were under 2 feet of water. A dozen of his sheep swept away. But the story that gripped the town was that the Wynn Ranch, on the most exposed part of the mesa, had survived. The barn was half gone, yes, but every animal was alive. The house was standing. The hay was saved. The people, who had come to her for small miracles, for fevers and grief, now looked at the woman on the mesa with something approaching awe. The final test came 3 days later. The storm was gone, but it had left a parting gift, a thick, cold fog that blanketed the entire region. It was a white, blind world. A wagon came fast up the mesa road, its wheels pounding. It was Mrs. Larrabee, her face a white mask of terror. Sheriff Pike was on horseback beside her, his face grim. "He's gone," she shrieked, falling from the wagon seat before it even stopped. "Timothy, he went out to the pump not 20 minutes ago, just to the pump, and he's gone. We've called and called. I can't find him. He's lost in this. He'll freeze." Carver was already moving. "I'll get the horses. We'll ride a line." "In this," Pike said, his voice muffled by the thick, white air. "You'll ride right past him, or off the edge of the mesa. We have to wait for it to lift." "He'll be dead by then," the mother wailed. Mariel, who had been standing on the porch, stepped down. She walked past the frantic mother, past the sheriff, past Carver. She walked to the pump, the center of the search, and she knelt. The group went silent. They watched her. She wasn't looking for tracks. The wet grass held nothing. She did what Carver had seen her do twice before. She placed her bare palm flat on the cold, damp earth. She closed her eyes. Her head was bowed, her body perfectly still. She was not praying. She was listening, not for a sound. She was listening for a disturbance in the earth, for the faint, lingering vibration of small, terrified feet, for the echo of a lost child. She stayed that way for a full, silent minute. Then she stood up. She did not look back for confirmation. She just started walking, a steady, purposeful pace, straight west, into the thickest patch of scrub cedar. "Mariel," Carver called. She didn't stop. "We follow her," Carver said to Pike, his voice certain. They moved. The 3 of them, a small, desperate procession, following the gray shape of the woman disappearing into the white. She walked with a strange, unerring certainty. She didn't hunt. She didn't pause. She skirted a patch of rocks, veered slightly north around a gully. "What is she doing?" Pike whispered, unnerved by the fog, by her confidence. "She's tracking," Carver said, his eyes never leaving her. "There are no tracks." "She isn't using her eyes," Carver said, a strange pride in his voice. "She's feeling the broken grass. She's reading the wind on her skin." They walked for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps 20 minutes. The fog was so thick, Carver could barely see her, a ghost just 10 feet ahead. Mariel stopped. She stood before a large, ancient cedar, its lower branches hanging to the ground, creating a dark, dry cave beneath. She knelt, reached into the darkness, and pulled him out. "Timothy." He was curled in a tight ball, his arms wrapped around his knees, shivering so hard his teeth chattered. He was too cold and too scared to even cry. "My baby, oh my God, my baby, Mrs." Larrabee ran forward, fell, and crawled the last few feet, snatching her son, pulling him into her arms, burying her face in his hair, her sobs raw and loud in the muffled air. Mariel stood back, watching them, her face calm. Carver looked at her, at this woman, this person. She was not a jinx. She was not a miracle. She was something more real. She was a woman who could hear a storm in a piece of wood, and who could feel a lost child in the earth. It was a power he didn't understand, but one he respected. down to his bones. Sheriff Pike was standing beside him. He took off his hat, his face damp with the fog. He looked at Marielle, then at the weeping mother, then at Carver. He nodded. A single, slow gesture of complete and total conviction. "Well, I'll be," Pike said, his voice low. "You were right. Win, she ain't deaf at all." He put his hat back on, his gaze fixed on Marielle with wonder. "She's the ear of the earth." The good news spread, but good news travels the same road as bad. It reached Gideon Rusk. He had wanted the water. He had wanted to crush the man who defied him. But this new information changed his calculations. A woman who could sense a storm before it hit, a woman who could find lost stock in a fog. That wasn't a woman, that was an asset, a tool more valuable than a dozen ranch hands. His greed, already a powerful thing, awakened. He looked at the legal papers on his desk, the ones claiming the water. He no longer just wanted to ruin Carver Wynn. He wanted to take what Carver Wynn had. He wanted the water. And he wanted the woman. On the ride back up the mesa, after Timothy was safe, Carver and Marielle rode side by side. The sun had finally burned through the fog, and the air was clean. He looked at her. She was tired, but she sat her horse tall. He reached across the space between them. He took her hand. He didn't just hold it. He gripped it, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. A firm, possessive, grounding hold. She turned, surprised by the strength in his hand. He met her gaze. His eyes were clear, his jaw set. No words were needed, no signs. The pressure of his hand, the look in his eyes, it said everything. You and me, against him, against everything. We are a team. She felt the strength flow from him to her, and she squeezed back. A team. Gideon Rusk did not ride up to the 7-mile mesa again. He was a man who preferred to wage his wars from a distance, using paper and ink as his primary weapons. His first move was not to send men, but to find one. He located Sloan, the drifter who had first brought Marielle to the auction block, in a whiskey-soaked ditch behind the Buckthorn Ferry Saloon. For $20 silver and the promise of more. Rusk didn't just buy the man's loyalty, he bought his memory. He acquired the crumpled, sweat-stained indenture document that Sloan had waved that day. Then, with his own lawyer present, he had Sloan sign a new, clean affidavit, one that twisted the truth. It claimed the $10 transaction with Carver Wynn was not a purchase, but a temporary custodial transfer to pay off a separate debt. It was a lie. Thin as onion skin, but it was a legal lie. Rusk now possessed a piece of paper that, in a crooked court, could be argued as a prior claim. His second move was to hire Cole Rance. Rance was a lean, quiet man with pale, empty eyes, a man Rusk kept on his payroll for tasks that required a lack of conscience. Rance was not tasked with violence. Not yet. He was tasked with harassment. The soft war began. Carver would wake to find a length of his fence cut, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander into the rocky arroyos. He would find the gate to his spring-fed water trough jammed open, draining precious water into the dry dirt. Small, infuriating acts of sabotage designed to stretch him thin, to keep him exhausted, to pull his attention away from the real threat. Simultaneously, Rusk changed the narrative in town. He stopped calling Marielle a jinx. He began to use a new, more dangerous word, evidence. He sat in Sheriff Ephraim Pike's office, his hat on his knee, the very picture of a concerned, law-abiding citizen. "Sheriff," he said, his voice smooth and reasonable, "I've uncovered a rather sordid business. It seems that drifter Sloan was involved in fraudulent indenture trading, a nasty affair, trafficking in persons, and that mute girl up on Wynn's property, she is the center of it. She is, in fact, the property in question." Pike leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning. His eyes narrowed. "What are you getting at, Gideon?" "I am a man who believes in the letter of the law." Rusk said, He slid the new, notarized affidavit, along with Sloane's original paper, across the desk. I have acquired the original contract. That girl is, by the state statute regarding indentured persons, a legal asset. She is evidence in a fraud case I intend to file against Sloane. But more than that, she is a contracted worker, and I now hold that contract. He leaned forward. I am formally demanding that you, as sheriff, enforce the statute. I want you to retrieve that asset and hold her, pending a formal hearing on her true ownership, which is, of course, mine. Pike looked at the papers, then at Rusk. He felt a cold knot in his stomach. It was a perversion of the law, a dangerous, dusty loophole that treated a human being as a stray cow. Gideon, this is 1883. We don't just retrieve people. The law says you do. Sheriff, Rusk said, his voice losing its smoothness, turning cold and sharp as a knife. The law, in this specific case, says she isn't a person. She's an indenture. You ignore this, you're ignoring your oath, and I will have your badge for it. Pike knew he was trapped. He rode up to the mesa that evening, his horse slow, his heart heavy. He explained the situation to Carver, standing by the cottonwood bench, the sun setting, casting long, cold shadows. He's got a judge in Old Waco, Pike finished, his voice weary. He's petitioning for an order. You've got maybe 2 weeks. Carver, maybe less. My hands are tied. Carver stood for a long time after the sheriff left, his face a mask carved from the mesa stone. Marielle came out, wiping her hands on her apron. She had watched the entire exchange. She had seen the tension in Pike's shoulders, the hard stillness in Carver's. She came to him and signed, her hands clear in the dusk. Bad. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and his anger hardened into a cold resolve. He nodded. Rusk, he wants to take you. He is using paper. Law. Her face went pale, but her eyes didn't fill with fear. They filled with a cold, righteous anger that mirrored his own. Carver was quiet, but he was not weak. He rode to Old Waco the next day, bypassing the bank and the land office. He went to a small, second-story office over the telegraph station. The sign on the door, painted in simple black letters, read Nora Bell, attorney at law. Nora Bell was a woman in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent brown eyes and a mind that moved with the speed and precision of a telegraph key. She wore a plain, practical dress and no-nonsense spectacles. She listened to Carver's entire halting story, from the auction block to the sheriff's warning, her hands steepled, her gaze never leaving his face. This isn't a case about water, Mr. Wynne, not anymore, she said, her voice crisp and clear. This is a case about human trafficking, disguised as a property dispute. Rusk's entire claim, and the judge's order, will be based on the legitimacy of that indenture paper, the paper he got from Sloane. It's a lie, Carver said. The law doesn't care about your truth, Mr. Wynne. It only cares about its truth. Find me the original. Find out where that paper came from. Go back to the auction. Find the sale ledger. If his paper is a fake, his entire case isn't just weak, it's criminal. Carver returned to the mesa. He went to Marielle, who was in the listening room. Grinding herbs, he sat at the table and wrote on the chalkboard, which he'd brought inside. I need to find the auction book. From Buckthorn Ferry. The day I found you. Where did the men with the papers, where did they stay? She read the words. She stopped her work, her hands still. She closed her eyes. She was not trying to remember a sight. She was trying to remember a smell. She had been led past the stalls, past the well. She remembered the noise, the jeers, but she also remembered the scent. The men who had handled her, the ones organizing the event, they had smelled different. She opened her eyes. She picked up the chalk. She didn't write. She drew a crude map of the market square, the well, the saloon, the blacksmith, and then a small, square building tucked in the alley behind the saloon. She looked at Carver and signed, her hands precise and quick. Smell strong. She tapped her nose, her eyes focused on the memory. She mimed smoking a thick cigar. Tobacco, heavy, wet. Then she mimed trimming a lamp wick, her fingers twisting, and held her hand to her nose. Oil, kerosene, strong, spilled. She pointed to the small, square building on her map. The men, they were in there, with the book. It was a storage warehouse, used by the Buckthorn Ferry Market Committee once a month and left locked and forgotten the rest of the time. Carver went that night, well after midnight. He didn't break the lock. He found a loose board on the back wall, just as he'd expected from such a poorly maintained building. He slipped inside, striking a match and lighting his lantern. The place was exactly as she had described. The air was thick and stale, a potent, foul perfume of old cigar smoke and spilled lamp oil. Against the back wall, under a fly-specked window, was a tall, dusty desk, and on it, a thick, leather-bound ledger. His heart pounded against his ribs. He opened it, the dry pages crackling. He ran his rough, calloused finger down the entries for that day, 6 months prior. Item 1 bay mare, 16 hands, sold $12. Item 2 dozen hens, crated, sold $3. Item 1 freight wagon, axle cracked, sold $8. He kept reading, his breath held, and then he found it. Item 1 roan mare, lame, sold $5. Buyer C, win. He scanned the page, then the one before, then the one after. His blood ran cold. She was not there. There was no mention of a girl, no indenture, no Sloan. The roan mare was the last item of the day. Carver leaned closer to the ledger, his mind racing. At the bottom of the page, there was a signature. Amos C. Fry, Market Supervisor. He fumbled in his own coat. He pulled out the greasy, folded paper Sloan had given him, the one he had taken and stuffed in his pocket, the one he had never, in all this time, bothered to read. He unfolded it. It was not a formal indenture. It was a crude bill of sale, claiming 1 mute female, approx. 19 years as is, and at the bottom, a signature Amos C. Fry. Carver held his lantern in one hand, holding the official ledger and the forged paper side by side. The signatures, they were identical, too identical. The loop of the A in Amos was exactly the same. The downward stroke of the F in Fry had the exact same width and slight tremor. It wasn't a second signature, it was a tracing. Sloan's paper was a forgery, a crude, desperate one, made in haste, that no one had ever bothered to check. Rusk, in his arrogance, had based his entire legal claim on a worthless, fraudulent document. Carver did not hesitate. He ripped the page from the ledger. He was back in Nora Bell's office at sunrise, the ledger page and the forgery laid out on her desk. She looked at the 2 signatures. She looked at the blank ledger entry. A slow, cold, dangerous smile spread across her face. Mr. Wynne, she said, her voice sharp with triumph. Mister, Rusk has just handed us the rope. He thought he was building a case for property fraud. What he has actually done is make himself a knowing accomplice to human trafficking, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud the court. He is the one who is trafficking in persons, not you. She folded the papers. Rusk thinks he's the hunter. He just became the prey. Rusk must have been warned. Perhaps Nora Bell filed an initial counterclaim, or perhaps Rusk's tame judge in Waco sent a query back. Rusk's strategy of cold legal pressure changed overnight. The harassment escalated. It was no longer about cut fences. It was about fear. A shadow was seen by the chicken coop. The horses, safe in the rebuilt barn, would suddenly scream in the night, kicking the stall walls, spooked by a man they could smell but not see. Then, a rock. It smashed through the new glass window of the listening room, shattering the pane, showering Mariel's shelves of herbs and salves in sharp, glittering fragments. Carver was out the door in a second, his shotgun in his hand. But there was nothing, just the sound of a single horse, galloping away into the darkness, and a cold laugh. He came back inside, his face a mask of cold fury. Marielle was on her knees, calmly picking up the largest pieces of glass, her hands not even shaking. Her anger was as cold and as deep as his. That night, Carver boarded up the broken window with thick pine. He spent the next day not on ranch work, but on fortification. He strung a new, higher fence line, closer to the house. He set bear traps on the dark paths leading to the barn and the spring. He didn't just light one lantern on the porch. He lit 4, one on each corner of the house, keeping them burning all night, casting a bright, defiant circle of light in the surrounding darkness. He was making a fortress. Marielle watched him, her eyes following his grim, efficient movements. She saw the new, hard lines around his mouth. She saw the way his hand never left the grip of the shotgun he now carried everywhere. She went to the chalkboard. She wiped it clean of all the ranch notes, of the weather predictions and the feed lists, and she wrote one sentence in large, clear letters that filled the entire board. No one can take a person from a person's home. Only a thing. Carver came in, his hands raw from digging post holes. He read the words. He looked at her. He placed his large, dirty hand over the chalk, then moved it, covering her hand with his. Sheriff Pike, now armed with Nora's affidavit, was forced to act. He rode up to Rusk's ranch, investigating the claim of harassment and intimidation. He was met with polite, smiling denials. He rode to Carver's, investigating Rusk's counterclaim of stolen property. The town was split down the middle. Mrs. Larrabee and the families Marielle had helped were furious, openly calling Rusk a bully. But Rusk was a powerful man. He employed half the men in the valley. Mr. Nettles at the hardware store and others who relied on Rusk's business began to mutter again. They didn't call Marielle a jinx. They just said, "It's too much trouble. She's just trouble." The town was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Cole Rance provided it. It was a moonless night, a week before the court date. The air was still. Carver was asleep in the chair by the door, the shotgun across his lap. Marielle was in her cot, but she was not asleep. She was in that deep, listening state, her senses attuned to the world. She sat bolt upright, her eyes snapped open in the dark. Smoke. It wasn't the familiar, comforting smell of their own pine chimney. It wasn't the sulfur of a struck match. It was something else, oily, chemical, a wrong smoke. She was out of bed, her hand on Carver's shoulder, shaking him. He was awake instantly. "Fire," she signed, her hands a blur, pointing toward the barn. He was out the door, running. He saw it. Not the barn itself, but the new hay shed, the one they had fought the storm to save. A small, hungry flicker of yellow was climbing the back wall. They didn't need to speak. They were the team that had survived the storm. He ran for the pump, for the buckets. She ran for the heavy wet blankets they now kept in a barrel by the door, just in case. The fire was young, but it was catching fast, fed by the kerosene Rance had splashed on the wood. Carver threw the first bucket, and the flames hissed, angered. Marielle came, throwing the heavy sopping blanket over the worst of it. They beat it, they soaked it, they smothered it. In 5 minutes, it was over. A black, stinking, charred patch on the back of the shed. The winter's feed was saved. Carver examined the ground with his lantern. The earth was soft from a recent rain, and there, pressed deep into the mud, was a perfect, cleat-marked boot print. Rance. Carver growled. He knew that print. He'd seen Cole Rance wearing those specific mail-order boots in Buckthorn Ferry. They didn't just have a forgery. They had attempted arson. They had a witness. Rusk knew it, too. When Cole Rance returned, muddy and smelling of smoke, Rusk knew his legal clean plan was finished. He couldn't wait for Nora Bell to spring her trap in court. He couldn't let Carver and the sheriff connect the arson directly to him. He was getting desperate. The news came 2 days later, not from Pike, but from Mrs. Larrabee, who had ridden up the Mesa Road, her horse lathered. "Carver Rusk's posted notices," she said, gasping for breath, her hand on her chest. "Not here in Dry Willow Crossing." Dry Willow was a dusty, lawless crossroads in the next county, a place known for horse thieving and quick, cash-only sales. "He's calling a public auction," she cried. "He's claiming salvage rights on the indenture. He's posted a public claim. He says he's going to sell her this Sunday. He's not waiting for the court. He's making his own law." It was a desperate, brilliant, and evil move. If he could sell her, even in a sham auction, to one of his own men, he would create a new, clean bill of sale. He would launder his bad title. He was forcing Carver's hand, daring him to show up in a place where Rusk's gun hands, not a judge, made the law. Carver stood very still, the world narrowing to a single point. "This Sunday." "Yes, at noon he's bringing men. Carver. He's bringing Cole Rance and half a dozen others. He's not expecting you to come. He's expecting to just do it." Carver looked at Marielle, who had come to stand beside him. He saw the old, dead stillness, the shadow of the auction block, pass over her face. He put his arm around her, pulling her close to his side. "He's wrong," Carver said, his voice a low, cold promise. "He's expecting me to be scared. He's not expecting Nora Bell, and he's not expecting the truth." He turned to Marielle. He signed, his hands steady and clear. "We go together." She looked at the charred wall of the hay shed. She looked at the boarded-up window of her room, and she looked at his face. She nodded. Together. The news had come 2 days prior, carried by a winded, panicked rider from a neighboring ranch Sunday. Noon, Dry Willow Crossing. Gideon Rusk was not waiting for the court in Waco. He was, in his own words, presenting his legal claim and holding a public auction to liquidate the asset tied to Sloane's fraudulent indenture. Dry Willow Crossing was not a town. It was a scar, a collection of raw pine shacks, canvas tents, and a single, ramshackle saloon at a dusty crossroads in the next county, a place where the law was whatever the man with the most guns said it was. It was Rusk's home turf. Sunday morning. The air in the cabin on 7 Mile Mesa was painfully still. Carver Wynn was preparing for war. He had saddled his best horse, the Steady Bay, in his saddlebags. He had a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped packet. Inside was the ledger page he'd taken from the auctioneer's office. Inside was the original, fraudulent bill of sale. Inside were the notarized affidavits from Nora Bell, copied and countersigned. He stood by the cold stove, pulling on a clean shirt, a white one. Not his usual flannel. It was a deliberate act. This was a public affair. His fingers, calloused and thick from a life of mending fence and hauling rock, fumbled with the small, pearl buttons. They were shaking. He was not a man given to trembling, but this was not the simple fear of a fight. It was the cold, hollow terror of what he stood to lose. It was a rage so deep it made his muscles vibrate. He felt her presence. Marielle stepped in front of him. She had been watching, her own face pale and still, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. She saw his fumbling, shaking hands. She did not sign, she did not gesture. She simply stepped closer, moving inside his guard. She lifted her own hands, which were not quite steady, and covered his gently, but with an undeniable firmness. She pushed his fumbling hands aside. She took the half-done button between her thumb and forefinger. Her fingers brushed the skin of his chest. He stopped breathing. Slowly, her eyes fixed on her task, she buttoned his shirt. One, then the next. Her movements were a deliberate, calming rhythm, a counterpoint to the frantic thunder of his heart. When she reached the collar, her knuckles brushed his beard. She finished, but she did not step back. She raised her eyes to his. He looked down into her face, and the world narrowed to the few inches between them. Marielle lifted her hand and rested her palm against his forehead, then leaned in, pressing her own brow against his. Skin to skin. It was their silent language. It was her way of listening to the tremor of his fear. He closed his eyes, and the shaking in his body stilled, met and absorbed by her quiet strength. He could smell the scent of lavender and herbs in her hair. He could feel her slow, even breath against his chin. He opened his eyes. He could see the reflection of the cabin window in her pupils. Her eyes were wet, but they were blazing. He moved his head, just an inch, and pressed his lips to hers. It was not the gentle, questioning kiss they had shared by the fire. This was a kiss of truth and of desperation. It was long and deep and quiet, a lifetime of suppressed silence pouring into a single, binding act. It held the taste of salt and fear and a furious, grounding loyalty. It was a kiss that said, "I will not lose you, and I will die for this." His hands came up, not to pull her closer, but to rest on the small of her back, his palms flat, holding her steady, holding himself steady. Her own hands gripped his shoulders, her fingers digging in, anchoring him. They were two pillars, holding each other up against the hurricane. He pulled back, his forehead still resting against hers. His voice was a low, rough whisper. "I will not let him take you." She heard the words, read them on his lips. She pulled back just enough to sign, her hands quick and sharp. Together. He covered her hand with his, a bruising grip. He signed back, "Together." They rowed into Dry Willow Crossing at 5 minutes to noon. Carver rode the bay. Marielle rode the roan mare, the horse that had been her partner in bondage, now her partner in freedom. They were followed by a single, plain wagon, driven by Nora Bell. Beside her sat Sheriff Ephraim Pike, his face grim, his hand resting on his thigh, near his holster. He was not wearing his badge in the open. The market was a dusty, open square, filled with 100 men. It was not a town crowd. This was Rusk's crowd. Drifters, hired guns, and curious ranchers drawn by the promise of a spectacle. Gideon Rusk stood on the bed of a freight wagon, a small, dark-suited man beside him. Rusk was holding aloft a piece of paper, the affidavit he had bought from Sloan. "The law is the law," Rusk was bellowing, his voice carrying over the uneasy murmur. "Even in a hard land, we must have order. I have here a legal, binding contract, witnessed and sworn." The man beside him, a preacher from an unknown county, stepped forward. "The sacred order of property," the preacher cried. "A contract is a covenant. This man has been wronged. His property stolen. We are here to see that covenant restored." The crowd shifted, their sympathies being swayed by the twin powers of authority and moral righteousness. Into this, Carver Wynn rode. He rode straight through the parted crowd, his horse not slowing until it stood nose to nose with Rusk's wagon. Marielle was right beside him, her back straight, her chin high, her eyes fixed on Rusk. Rusk's face, which had been a mask of triumph, curdled with surprise and fury. "Wynn, you are trespassing. This is an official, legal proceeding." Carver swung his leg over the saddle. He landed in the dust, a tall, solid shadow against the harsh sun. He looked up at Rusk, his voice not loud, but raw, carrying the weight of the iron-hard mesa. "Not while I still stand here." The crowd went dead silent. "You have no say." "Wynn," Rusk snarled. "This is a matter of law. I have the paper." "And I—" A clear, sharp voice cut through the air. "Have the truth." Nora Bell stepped down from her wagon, holding her briefcase. She walked to the center of the clearing, directly between Carver and Rusk. "Gideon Rusk," she said, her voice projecting to every man there. "You have made a terrible, terrible mistake." Sheriff Pike stepped down beside her. He looked at Rusk. He looked at the crowd. And then he looked at a man standing near the wagon. A man with pale eyes and a confident sneer. Cole Rance. "Gideon, this matter of a contract is for a judge to decide," Pike said, his voice calm and conversational. "But arson is a different matter." The sneer on Rance's face vanished. "Cole Rance," Pike said, his voice hardening. "I have a boot print, a witness, and a barrel of your kerosene. You are under arrest for the attempted arson of the Wynn Ranch." Pike took 2 steps toward Rance. It was the trigger. Rusk laughed. A short, ugly bark. "The law," he spat. He gave a sharp, almost invisible nod. Click! The sound was sharp, metallic, and unmistakable. Click, click! The sound of 3 rifle hammers being pulled to full cock. 1 gunman was on the porch of the saloon. 2 more were in the crowd, their rifles suddenly visible. All 3 weapons aimed directly at Carver and the sheriff. The crowd screamed. It was a single, panicked surge. Men dove for cover, scrambling behind barrels, behind horses, anywhere. The horses tied to the hitching rail screamed, their eyes white. They reared, snapping tethers, and the front of the square exploded into a mass of panicked kicking, stampeding animals. "Carver!" Nora yelled, diving behind her wagon. Pike drew his pistol, but he was exposed, his eyes on Rance. Carver shoved Marielle to the ground, throwing his body over hers. But she didn't stay down. She scrambled out from under him, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with focus. She wasn't looking at the gunmen. She was looking at the horses. The lead animal, a huge black stallion, was rearing, about to trample a man who had fallen in the dirt. The whole herd was about to bolt, to scatter, to trample everything, blocking any chance of escape or order. "Marielle, get down," Carver roared. She ran. She ran toward the panic. She moved in a low, fast crouch, dodging a panicked drifter, and slid to a stop directly in front of the rearing, screaming stallion. The horse's hooves flashed inches from her face. She did not grab for its reins. She did not scream. She stood her ground, looked up into its wild, white eyes, and she did what she had done for the roan mare. She lifted her hand, palm flat, and pressed it to the horse's trembling, sweat-soaked neck, and she breathed. A long, slow, centering breath. The stallion froze. Its hooves hit the dirt. It let out a massive, shuddering snort. It tossed its head once, then stood, its sides heaving, but its panic broken. The rest of the horses, their lead established, stopped scrambling, just milling in a confused, but no longer frantic, circle. Marielle had calmed the chaos. She had created a path. The entire square was frozen in a moment of stunned disbelief. The gunmen, the crowd, Rusk, all of them, were staring at the small woman with her hand on the great horse. Sheriff Pike used the moment. Bang. He fired his pistol, not at a man, but straight into the air. The sound was a deafening, final crack. "Enough," he roared into the ringing silence. "The first man who moves, other than to drop his weapon, is dead. I am the law in this county, and it seems I am the law in this one, too." The gunmen hesitated, their rifles still up, but their certainty gone. "Nora!" Pike yelled. Nora Bell did not hesitate. She grabbed her packet, climbed up onto the wagon bed that Rusk had used, and stood tall. She unrolled a document, the affidavit, and her voice, sharp as a razor, sliced through the tension. Under Texas Statute 34A, the transport or sale of a person under a fraudulent indenture is a felony, she announced, her voice ringing. The Buckthorn Ferry Auction Ledger, the official ledger. She held up the page. Shows no sale of any person on that day, this document. She held up Rusk's prized affidavit. Is a forgery. The signature of Amos Fry is a tracing it is void, and any man, including Gideon Rusk, who attempts to enforce a fraudulent document for the purpose of trafficking, is guilty of a felony, a state prison felony. The words hit the crowd like stones. Felony, forgery, state prison. Rusk's face was ashen. His legal claim had just become a criminal indictment. A new movement came from the crowd. It wasn't a panic, it was a choice. Elder Bram Tolley, the minister from Buckthorn Ferry, stepped out. He was followed by Mr. Nettles and Mrs. Larrabee and Silas Davies, the man whose boy Mariel had saved. The community was stepping out from cover. Elder Tolley, his black coat covered in dust, cleared his throat. His voice was not loud, but it was absolute.
Mr. Rusk,
he said, his gaze fixed on the powerful rancher.
We must have fairness before the Lord. And this is not fairness. This is an abomination. Put down your guns.
It was over. The gunmen, seeing their employer's power evaporate, seeing the crowd turn, lowered their rifles. Rusk looked at Carver. His eyes filled with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical thing. He looked at Mariel, who was still standing by the horse. He was defeated. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his hands.
This is not over. Win,
he snarled, his voice a low, vicious promise. There are other ways to get your water. He motioned to his men. They did not run. They backed away. A slow, hateful retreat, mounted their horses, and rode out of Dry Willow Crossing, leaving Cole Rance standing alone in the dust, Pike's handcuffs snapping onto his wrists. The crowd let out a long, collective sigh. Carver walked to Mariel. He was shaking again, this time with the aftermath. He reached for her, his hand trembling. She met his gaze. She gave him a small, weary smile, but she held up one finger. Wait. She walked to Nora's wagon, took a piece of paper from the briefcase, and the pencil. She wrote one line, her script clear and strong. She walked past Carver, past the sheriff, and climbed onto the wagon bed herself. She stood where Rusk had stood, where Nora had stood. She was small, and her dress was torn, but she stood like she owned the sky. She held the paper high, for every man to see. I am a free woman. The wind, which had been still, gusted, catching the paper. It fluttered in her hand. A small, white, defiant flag. The fight at Dry Willow Crossing had been won with breath and bravery, but the war was won with paper and ink. Gideon Rusk had fled the crossroads, but he had not fled the county. He returned to his sprawling ranch, a fortress of money and influence, believing he could ride out the storm, that the fury of a few townsfolk was no match for his lawyers and his bankroll. He had never met Nora Bell. She did not return to 7 Mile Mesa with Carver and Mariel. She did not celebrate. She took her wagon, with the now cooperative Cole Rance chained in the back, directly to the county seat in Waco. She arrived at the courthouse at dawn on Monday, before the clerks had even opened their doors. She did not file a defense. She launched an invasion. The papers she filed were a masterpiece of legal retribution. She filed a criminal complaint on behalf of the county, charging Gideon Rusk with 3 counts conspiracy to commit human trafficking, citing the fraudulent indenture and the sham auction, felony forgery, citing the traced signature of Amos Fry, and conspiracy to commit arson, with Cole Rance as his paid agent. But it was her civil suit that was the masterstroke. She filed not on behalf of Carver Wynn, but on behalf of the community of Buckthorn Ferry. She sued Rusk for damages, citing his pattern of economic and physical intimidation, his deliberate attempt to destabilize the community through fear, and his illegal conspiracy to monopolize a public water trust. She did not ask for money for Carver. She demanded a punitive seizure of Rusk's assets, to be paid directly into a newly created town fund for public works. She was, in a single legal document, turning Rusk's own wealth against him, making every citizen in town a plaintiff in his downfall. The case was not a matter of he said, she said. It was an avalanche of evidence. Sheriff Ephraim Pike, no longer constrained by Rusk's political influence, presented his findings to the circuit judge. First, the boot. The print left in the mud behind Carver's hay shed was a perfect, undeniable match to the custom-made, cleated boots Cole Rance was wearing upon his arrest. Faced with 20 years for arson, Cole Rance's loyalty evaporated. He confessed. He gave Nora Bell a sworn, 10-page affidavit detailing every meeting, every payment, every order Rusk had given him, from cutting the fences to setting the fire. He even, as a final, desperate plea for leniency, told them about Rusk's hidden powder cache, a case of blasting powder Rusk kept for removing stumps, but which Rance knew was for escalation. Pike's deputies found it exactly where Rance said it would be. The final nail in the legal coffin was Amos C. Fry. The small, nervous market supervisor was brought before the judge. He looked at Nora Bell. He looked at Sheriff Pike. And he looked at the two signatures, the real one from his ledger, the traced one from Rusk's forgery. He began to weep. He confessed that Rusk had cornered him months ago. Rusk held the note on Fry's small homestead. He held the debt at the general store. He had threatened to ruin Fry, to see his family turned out into the street. Fry admitted he had been coerced, forced to look the other way and validate the fraudulent paper. Gideon Rusk's entire legal shield, his claim of ownership, his very persona as a law-abiding citizen, was not just broken, it was annihilated. He was exposed as a common criminal, with the criminal case against him indefensible. Rusk's civil claim to the water on 7 Mile Mesa became a public joke. The judge, the same man who had once been friendly to Rusk's interests, now saw the political and moral wind blowing in a new direction. He reviewed the original county founding treaty, a document Nora Bell had unearthed from a dusty archive, dated 1851. The treaty was explicit. The spring on 7 Mile Mesa, being the headwaters for the entire lower valley, was designated a public commons trust to be protected for the benefit of all citizens. Rusk's attempt to monopolize it was not just greedy, it was a flagrant violation of the county's founding charter. The court issued an immediate and permanent injunction, barring Rusk or any of his agents from ever interfering with diverting or impeding the flow of the spring. Rusk had not just lost the battle, he had lost the water. This was Carver's true victory. He had his home, he had his water, and Marielle was safe. He could have stopped there. He could have returned to his mesa and pulled up the ladder, a king in his own quiet fortress. But he had learned from Marielle. He had learned from the town. He was no longer an island. A week later, on the day the ruling was made public, Carver Wynne rode into Buckthorn Ferry. He did not go to the saloon to celebrate. He went to the town hall, where Elder Tola, Mr. Nettles, and a half-dozen other town leaders were gathered, still reeling from the news. Nora Bell was with him. Carver unrolled a map of his own property, the one showing the spring and the creek. "Mr. Tolley," he said, his voice quiet. "This water is a gift. It was never meant to be a weapon." He then did the one thing Gideon Rusk, in all his greed, could never have anticipated. He signed a document Nora Bell had prepared. It was a formal, permanent covenant, ceding a partial, public right-of-way to the township of Buckthorn Ferry. He was not giving them the spring, but he was guaranteeing them, and their children, legal access to its overflow forever, to water their stock and fill their barrels. The cost $1, paid by the town, to make the contract binding. It was the ultimate checkmate. Rusk had tried to use the water to choke Carver out. Carver had used the same water to bind himself, inextricably. To the community Rusk had tried to control. He had not just defeated his enemy, he had replaced him, not as a tyrant, but as a provider. Gideon Rusk's fall was quiet. It was not a shootout, not a public spectacle. Sheriff Pike did not ride to Rusk's ranch in a posse. He simply waited. He waited until Rusk, in a desperate attempt to move his money, rode into the bank in Buckthorn Ferry. When Rusk stepped back onto the boardwalk, his face pale and drawn, Sheriff Pike was waiting for him, his hands folded.
Gideon,
Pike said, his voice not rising above a normal, conversational tone. The town stopped. The clang of Harrow's hammer ceased. Mrs. Gable, holding a bolt of cloth, came to the door of the general store. Men who had been Rusk's allies and men who had been his victims all turned. There was no shouting. There were no jeers. There was only a cold, profound, and judgmental silence. Rusk looked at Pike. He looked at the cold, staring faces of the people he had bullied for a decade. He did not run. He simply, visibly, deflated.
"It's over, Gideon,"
Pike said. He took Rusk's arm, turned him around, and snapped the handcuffs onto his wrists. As Pike led him the few yards to the town lockup, Mr. Nettles, who was watching from his hardware store, took a cloth and methodically began to polish a brass doorknob.
"Figured it would end this way,"
he was heard to mutter, his voice just loud enough to carry.
"Evil can't stand the bright light of day, and it sure as hell can't stand good, solid paperwork."
Carver was there. He had been buying grain when the moment came. He stood by his wagon, his hat pulled low. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He did not say a word. Mariel was at his side. As Rusk was led past, his gaze empty, his shoulders slumped. Carver simply reached down and took her hand. He didn't look at Rusk. He looked at Mariel. He held her hand, firm and steady. In the middle of the street, a quiet, public declaration. He had not sought revenge. He had sought justice. And he let the heavy, metallic click of the jail door closing be the only sound that mattered. The spell of fear over Buckthorn Ferry was broken. The silence that followed was not of fear, but of shame. The apologies began that afternoon. They came not in a flood, but in a slow, steady trickle. Harrow, the blacksmith, his face the color of the coals in his forge, came to Carver. "Mr. Wynne," he stammered, his large hands twisting his apron. I was wrong. I listened to Rusk. I listened to the wrong noise. You're your horses. They'll be shod free for as long as I'm here." Mrs. Gable, who had pulled her son away from Carver, brought a large bag of sugar and new glass-jarred candies to Mariel. I am so sorry," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid. You were brave." Elder Tolley's sermon that next Sunday was the shortest and most powerful in the town's history. He stood before his congregation, his Bible closed on the pulpit. "Friends," he said, his voice thick, "the good Lord gave us 2 ears, and he gave us 1 mouth. It has become clear to me that we, as a town, have been using them in the wrong proportion." He looked at the packed pews, at the faces of the people who had been so quick to grab torches, so slow to show mercy. "We have been loud," he said. "We have been filled with the noise of our own fear. We must learn to be quiet. We must learn to listen, not to the loudest voice, but to the truest one." He looked to the back pew, where Carver and Mariel sat together, and Elder Tolley, in a gesture that stunned the town, bowed his head. Amen. Life on the mesa settled. It was a new kind of quiet. The old, lonely silence was gone, replaced by a peace that was shared. Carver took down the old, faded, bullet-scarred Wynn Ranch sign at his front gate. He spent 2 days with his knife and a piece of smooth, cured pine. The new sign was simple. The letters were deep and clean. It did not bear his name. It read, 7 Mile Mesa, the home of those who listen. Inside the cabin, he took down the heavy pine boards he had nailed over the shattered window of the listening room, replacing them with a new, clear pane of glass that let the morning light flood in. Beside it, he hung a small, simple frame. It did not contain a picture. It contained a single piece of paper, a note Nora Bell had written to him after the trial. On it, in her neat, sharp script, was the quote from her closing argument. "Freedom is the natural, default state of man. Marielle saw him hang it. She watched him tap the small nail into the wood. She read the words. A small, private smile touched her lips. She left the cabin and went to her herb garden, which was now thriving in the safety of the ranch. She returned a moment later with a small, fresh bundle of wild mint. She didn't put it in a vase. She didn't press it in a book. She walked to the new frame, and she gently tucked the green, living spray of mint under the bottom edge, pinning it between the wood and the wall. The sharp, clean, life-affirming scent of it filled the small room. It was the smell of clean water. It was the smell of healing. It was the smell of the end of fear. That night, the fire was lit. The new window pane reflected the dancing flames, making it seem as if the entire room was alive with a soft, warm light. The cabin was quiet, sealed against the chill of the coming winter. Carver sat on the hearth, his back resting against the warm chimney stones. Marielle was sitting on the rug between his knees, her back resting against his chest. It had become their place. He was idly braiding her long, clean hair, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle, slow, and methodical. She leaned her head back, her head fitting perfectly into the crook of his shoulder. Her eyes closed, feeling the pull and tuck of his hands. He finished the braid, tying it off with a small, leather thong. He did not move his hands. He let them rest on her shoulders, then slide down, his arms wrapping around her from behind, his chest a solid, warm wall against her back. His hands found hers in her lap, his fingers lacing with hers. He pressed his chin to the top of her hair. It smelled of mint and wood smoke. They sat that way for a long time, the fire crackling, the logs shifting, a small, private tinder song. There were no words, there were no signs. There was only the shared, steady rhythm of their breathing. He bent his head, pressing a kiss to her temple. She turned her head, her cheek brushing his beard, her lips seeking his. He met her mouth. It was a kiss that held no shadows, no desperation, no lingering fear. It was long and slow and warm. It was a kiss of absolute peace, of promise, of a profound and unshakered sense of home. Their hands, laced together, rested in the flickering light, casting a single, shared shadow on the floor. The snows of that hard winter melted, and the spring that came to 7 Mile Mesa was not a quiet thaw, but a joyous, rushing flood of life. The grass, fed by the storm and the melt, grew thick and green, knee-high to the cattle. The air, which had held the iron-hard chill of survival, was now soft and smelled of damp earth and new clover. The ranch, which had been a fortress, became a school. It began with Timothy Larrabee. His mother brought him up, not with a sick child's terror, but with a mother's hope. He's too loud," she explained to Carver, her hands twisting. "He frightens the chickens. He spooks the pony. He doesn't listen. Can she teach him?" Marielle came out onto the porch. She looked at the small, restless boy. She smiled, a small, gentle smile, and gestured for him to come into the yard. Soon, other children came. Silas Davies's 2 daughters, and even the sons of Mr. Nettles, the back pasture, the one that had been a muddy trap, became their classroom. Marielle did not teach them to read or to write. She taught them to be. She taught them her language. She would have them stand in a line, their eyes closed, and she would sign wind. She'd have them feel the breeze on their faces, on their hands. "Is it a north wind?" Carver would translate for her, his voice low. "Or a south wind? One is hard. It smells of rock. The other is soft. It smells of water. Listen with your skin." She taught them the horses. She brought them to the roan mare, now fat, gentle, and scarred, a living monument to survival. The children were nervous, their movements quick and bird-like. Marielle would take a child's hand. She would place it, palm flat, on the mare's warm, solid neck. Then, she would place her own hand over theirs. She would breathe, a long, slow, deep sigh, The child, feeling the command, would mimic her. The horse, feeling the rhythm, would lower its head and sigh. 2. The children, one by one, learned to quiet the noise inside themselves. They learned to approach an animal not with a command, but with a breath. They learned to calm the cattle, to find the quietest place in a storm. When one of them finally understood, when Timothy Larrabee stood perfectly still and allowed a wild barn kitten to rub against his leg, he looked at Marielle, his eyes wide with triumph. She didn't clap, she didn't cheer. She just smiled her rare, bright smile and placed her hand over her own heart. I hear you. Well done. The ranch was no longer just a place of work. It was a place of peace. Carver finished the cottonwood bench, its legs set deep, its surface sanded as smooth as glass. It sat under the shade of the big tree, a permanent invitation to rest. Their evening settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. The work would end. They would wash, and they would sit on the bench as the sun went down, the sky turning a deep, aching violet. She would bring 2 cups of mint tea. One evening, Carver sat beside her. He pulled a small, worn harmonica from his shirt pocket. He was not a musician. He was a man who had once used the thin, reedy sound to fill an agonizingly large silence. He tapped it against his palm. He looked at her, almost shyly. She nodded, her eyes bright, encouraging him. He began to play. It was not a real song. It was a simple, nameless tune, a rising and falling of notes that spoke of the wind, and the hills, and the long, quiet nights. Marielle closed her eyes. She did not hear the music. She felt it. She leaned back, her shoulder just brushing his, and she could feel the vibration of the notes travel from his chest, through his arm, through the wood of the bench, and into her. She felt the cadence of his breath, the low, mournful notes, and the high, hopeful ones. She began to sway, just slightly, a tiny movement of her shoulders in time with a rhythm only she could feel. He watched her. He watched her listen to his song, and his heart, which had been a tight, locked-up thing for so long, felt so full it ached. He played on, the music a quiet promise in the dusk, until the first stars appeared. The news of Gideon Rusk's trial had spread far beyond the county line. He was found guilty on all counts, the forgery and conspiracy charges, proven by Nora Bell's ironclad evidence, had sent him to the state prison for what would be 10 years. His land, over-leveraged and built on debt, was seized by the banks and broken up. His reign was over. But the story that lasted, the one men told in saloons and general stores, was not about Rusk's fall. It was about Carver's covenant. Wagons began to arrive at 7 Mile Mesa, not for healing, but for counsel. Ranchers from the next valley over, men who were fighting their own wars over creeks and wells, rode up to Carver's gate. Mr. Wynne, we heard what you did with the Water Trust. Could we see the papers, Nora Bell's papers? Carver's act of revenge had not been revenge at all. It had been, as the outline in his mind had always known, a correction. He had not just saved his ranch. He had given the whole dry, thirsty country a new blueprint for peace. The Gideon Rusk model of taking, of choking, of monopolizing was broken. The Carver-Wynne model of sharing, of community, of law was being copied, deed by deed, across the territory. The land itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. One afternoon, a sudden, violent summer squall blew up from the south. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-black. The wind howled. A year ago, it would have been a cause for panic, a desperate fight for survival. This time, Carver and Marielle simply walked out of the house. They didn't run. They walked to the new, rebuilt hay shed. Marielle, her eyes on the sky, her senses tasting the ozone, grabbed the edge of the heavy, oiled tarp she had sewn with her own hands. Carver took the other end. They worked as a team, their movements fluid, economical, a practiced dance. They covered the hay, they tied the ropes, they latched the rebuilt barn door. They finished just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. They stood on the porch, side by side, and watched the storm. It was a magnificent, terrifying display of power, but it was no longer an enemy. It was just weather. The rain passed as quickly as it had come. They stood in the clean-washed air, the world dripping and shining. The grass, they both noted, was already visibly greener. The next morning, Carver rose and went to the chalkboard by the door. The slate was clean, wiped of yesterday's tasks, and in her neat, clear script, Mariel had written the day's first note. Today will be kind, I can feel it. And it was. The morning was bright and cool. The day's work was simple, and the visitors who came were not in crisis. Mrs. Larrabee stopped by, not with fear, but with a basket of fresh eggs and the town gossip. Silas Davies came to trade a side of bacon for a jar of Mariel's comfrey salve, not for an emergency, but just to have it on hand. The ranch had become the quiet, steady, beating heart of the community. It was a place where people came to share news, to leave small gifts, to just sit on the cottonwood bench and be quiet for a while. That night, the house was still. The day was done. Carver sat in the oak chair in the listening room, the new window pane reflecting the deep, starry blue of the twilight. The room was filled with the scent of drying herbs. Mariel, who had been cleaning the chalk slate, came and sat on the rug at his feet, her back resting against his knees. He put his book down and his hand came to rest on her hair, his fingers idly tracing the line of her shoulder. She leaned her head back, looking up at him, her face softened by the lamplight. He slid from the chair to sit on the rug with her, his back against the wall, pulling her close. He didn't say anything. He just pulled her into his arms, a tight, solid embrace, his face buried in her hair. She wrapped her own arms around his waist, holding him just as tightly. They stayed that way for a long time, just breathing, in, out, a shared rhythm, a shared life. He felt the steady, slow beat of her heart against his chest. He pulled back, his hands cupping her face. He looked at her, his eyes tracing every line, as if seeing her for the first time. He kissed her. It was a kiss of profound, established love. It was long, and it was deep, and it was unhurried. There was no shadow of the auction block, no ghost of Gideon Rusk, no fear of the future. It was just them. It was the intimacy of two people who had seen the worst of the world and had built a fortress of care and respect. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, her fingers spread wide, feeling the warmth of him. His hands held her face, then slid to her back, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world, and at the same time, the strongest. The kiss lingered, warm and deep, a slow, burning fire, and then, as if by a silent, shared signal, it softened, it ended, not with a gasp, but with a sigh. It stopped, as it always did, at that perfect, quiet place where the heart had said all it needed to say. They just held each other, foreheads touching, their shared breath warm in the small, safe space between them. He pulled back, his eyes clear and full of a truth that was as solid as the mesa beneath them. He signed, his hands slow, strong, certain. "You are home." She watched his hands, and a smile of such pure, radiant joy lit her face that it took his breath away. She touched his lips with her fingertips, a soft, quick gesture. Then she raised her own hands, her movements graceful and sure. "We are home." They walked out onto the porch, bundled against the night's chill. They stood, shoulder to shoulder, and looked at the sky. The stars were scattered like bright salt across black velvet. They stood on the hill, in the same spot where he had once looked at his father's grave with shame, and where they had faced a mob. Now it was just their hill. The wind blew, a cool, clean breath from the high plains. It was no longer a harbinger of storms or a carrier of loneliness. It was just the wind. It was the sound of the world breathing. It carried away the last ghosts of their solitude, the last echoes of their long, lonely years. The hoofbeats of fear were gone. The shouting of angry men was a forgotten, distant dream. All that was left was the low, steady whisper of the community in the valley below, and the quiet, solid presence of the person beside him. They had forged a new language, one deeper than sound, built of shared breath and hard work, and a loyalty that had been tested by fire and water. Carver knew that tomorrow the sun would rise, he would mend the tack, and she would gather her herbs, and someone new, a stranger, would rattle up the road in a dusty wagon. They would knock on the door, their hat in their hands, their eyes anxious. "Ma'am," they would ask, looking at Mariel. I was told I have this horse, a good horse, but it's broken. It won't be gentled. They say you know how to breathe with them. Can you teach me?" And Mariel would look at the man's anxious hands. She would look at his hopeful, fearful eyes. She would smile. She would point to the cottonwood bench, an invitation to sit, and she would begin, as she always did, with silence. And if one day that man, or any man, were to ask if love needed a voice to reel the wind, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood trees on 7 Mile Mesa, would answer for them. It would answer in a language older than words, not while we still stand here. Thank you for listening to this story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please comment below and let's share our thoughts. We invite you to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.